And then Councillor Viger, who I gather isn't here either. So we've had those answers. So that covers the questions on topics not on the agenda. We'll come to the rest of them, I think mostly Chippenham when we get to it. So we then come on to agenda item 6, proposal to retain and invest in Silverwood School, Chippenham and Trowbridge campuses. I'm going to ask Laura to introduce this, then Jane to come in, and then we'll move on from there.
Thank you, Richard. Well, I'm absolutely delighted to bring this paper to Cabinet, which outlines our plans to develop our system of excellence to improve outcomes for children with SEND in Wiltshire. It builds on our successful programme to bring our special school provision up to date to meet the increased demand for school places. Now, as everyone knows, this has been a long journey, but in November 19, the Cabinet approved the establishment of a new maintained special school with a single leadership team. I'm very pleased that the head of Silverwood is here, from the existing St Nicholas, Roudford and Larkrise schools. This happened in September 2020, and the new school is called Silverwood, and it's one school with 3 sites. The Cabinet improved the expansion of the school at Roud to accommodate up to 400 pupils, and for the sites in Chippenham and Trowbridge to stay in use until that new provision was ready. In 2019, Wiltshire allocated £3.6 million of capital funding to fund 50 extra places for Silverwood School under the scheme Phase 5 Capital Works. Based on our latest estimates, it's recommended this funding is used to secure sufficient places at Silverwood School in Chippenham and Trowbridge campuses. We want to invest the money in these campuses to bring them up to standard and propose the 2 sites change from all through to primary only, and reducing pupil numbers to address the capacity issues. Children will leave the school at 11 to go to the Roud site where they can enjoy their secondary education in the new premises. So I'm going to hand over to Jane to take you through some of the detail and then ask the Cabinet to approve the proposals on page 5 of the agenda supplement.
Thank you, Laura. I'll keep it brief. I'm sure you've all read the papers. As you've heard from Laura, this proposal is about investing in the delivery of additional high-quality special school places. We are doing this within the system of excellence, which works with mainstream schools to provide additional capacity and better inclusion and teaching. It's definitely the Wiltshire Council ambition to create an integrated and inclusive education for children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. This report seeks Cabinet approval to invest in Silverwood School, Chippenham and Trowbridge campuses and to launch a formal consultation on changes arising from the proposed redesign and refurbishment of them. The remodelling of the campuses requires a reduction of the current number of both classrooms and pupil numbers, down to 75 per site, to comply with modern standards of provision and provide equity with facilities at the Roud site. It is also proposed that both sites become primary phase campuses. So this requires a formal consultation on 2 things. Firstly, the proposed change from all through primary phase campuses at Chippenham and... Sorry, I'll repeat that to be absolutely clear. First of all, the proposed change from all through to primary phase only campuses at Chippenham and Trowbridge, and a reduction in pupil numbers at Chippenham and Trowbridge campuses to address the capacity issues. The proposals are quite long. Would you like me to read them, Richard? 1 to 5.
Honestly, I think at this point, yes, I would. Given how involved this has been as a topic previously, I think it's probably better if we make sure that's all firmly
Absolutely. Okay, so the proposals are, it's recommended that Cabinet meets its commitments made in November 2019 to consult on the future of the Silverwood campuses, taking account of the forecast demand for special school places in Wiltshire and the views of current and future stakeholders, and in particular, children and young people with SEND and their parents and carers. 2, that Cabinet approves the use of statutory processes under the Making Significant Changes Prescribed Alterations to Maintained Schools Guidance, November 2018, to launch a formal consultation on the proposed change to Silverwood School pupil numbers and the change in age range on the campuses. The proposal would create 75 primary school places, reception to Year 6 at the Chippenham campus, and 75 primary school places, reception to Year 6 at the Trowbridge campus. The consultation will be on the change of use of Chippenham and Trowbridge campuses from all through to primary and a reduction in Silverwood pupil numbers. A consequence of this proposal is that Silverwood Roud would become the sole campus offering secondary education for Silverwood students. 3, following formal consultation, Cabinet considers the proposal to retain and refurbish Silverwood School, Chippenham and Trowbridge campuses funded from pre-approved Silverwood Phase 5 capital funding. 4, decision-making in respect of implementing the proposals in respect of Silverwood School is delegated to the Director of Education and Skills. 5, Silverwood Phase 5 capital funds are already approved and delegated to the Director of Education and Skills. It is recommended that the Director can apply the capital funds in the refurbishment and fit-out of Chippenham and Trowbridge campuses to deliver equity of provision in shared spaces, finishes and fittings, furniture and equipment, with specifications for the new build at Roud campus. The Director of Education and Skills is authorised to apply some of the Phase 5 delegated budget, if necessary, to facilitate works at the adjacent schools at Harden Hewish, Chippenham campus, and Paxcroft, Trowbridge campus, to support Silverwood students in accessing outdoor recreational and PE space to better meet space planning standards and more inclusive play opportunities.
Thank you, Jane. Sorry to be making you read all that out, but I do think, I think just to provide that clarity, given the detailed discussions that were had by Cabinet when these decisions were first made. I then move on to Cabinet. Do any Cabinet members have any comments they want to make? I mean, I think if I comment from my own perspective, it was very clear when we went through this process last time that we were looking at forecast numbers as they were then with a degree of uncertainty, which is why caveats were put in. It's clear, and listening to Radio 4 on the drive-in this morning, that the increasing issues around SEND, the increasing demand is not going away. Government having to put significant more resource in. Therefore, I think it's entirely understandable that when we look at numbers, we then need to be planning for that provision of further places. And therefore, this seems to me a very sensible way to be proceeding. The critical issue here is that we are providing a sufficiency of places, and based on what Radio 4 was saying, that clearly is an issue across parts of the country. But by thinking ahead and making sure we've got that sufficiency of places and meeting that demand, I think that's the most important factor that we're looking at. If I then come to, I normally come to scrutiny first. I don't know if John is with us. Do we have someone attending on behalf of John? Yes. So you'll need to use your mic, please.
I was expecting, sorry, Councillor Christopher Williams, Vice Chair of Review and Scrutiny, standing in for Councillor Graham Wright, who gives us apologies. And I must admit, I was expecting Councillor John Hubbard here this morning to address this. But all I can say is that I do know they had a briefing of the Chair and Vice Chair of Children's Select Committee on the 17th of November, and I presume all their questions and points were answered at that briefing. Nothing further to add at this time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So I then come to Ian.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Good morning, Ian Thorne, Councillor for Carn Central, Leader of the Liberal Democrats on Wiltshire Council. With your permission, if I may, can I just offer my congratulations to all of those Wiltshire Council employees who have been working so hard over the past 2 or 3 days to cope with the weather that we've had, particularly those who have been involved directly in keeping our roads as safe as they possibly can. Thank you very much indeed for that. Yes, can I firstly start in terms of Agenda item 6 in terms of saying how delighted I am with the report. I think it's incredibly good news. I think it's really encouraging. I think many of us sat in this chamber over many months ago, years ago, with the discussions that took place in relation to the future of the schools, both at Chippenham and at Trowbridge. And I pay tribute to the parents, the carers, the families who were so active, who were so involved, and whose voices were so clear and loud in terms of what they thought was best and most important for their families. So I say thank you very much to those families who were involved and of course continue to be involved. But this is very, very good news, and I congratulate officers and indeed members of the Cabinet who have made this situation happen. I guess I have two final points. One is in relation to the fact that the two schools will become primary only, and therefore one would have to consider the impact on families in relation to their children and young people who will no longer be able to attend those schools in a secondary capacity, which gives me some concern. But I think more important than that, of course, will be the consultation process that takes place moving forward in relation to these proposed changes. And I guess my final point is that, as clearly has been the case in this instance, the views, the values and the vision of parents will listen to. And again, I congratulate those who listened and acted. I've got no doubt at all that the views and ambitions of the parents through the consultation will be listened to equally. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. If I then come on to any other members, anyone else who wants to ask a question on this topic? No? Was there something you wanted to come back on, Laura? Or?
Well, just to reassure Councillor Thorne that the consultation process has already started. So parents were informed. I'm here with Sean McKeown, who's the head of Silverwood, is here. And we'll be working with parents and staff as well, because they'll be affected. And it'll be part of the process. But I think the ability for children with disabilities to move up to secondary school like their peers, I think is very, very important in this. And I think normalising life in that way is excellent. So we will support parents and families through that. But as you say, overall, this is a good thing to be doing.
Thank you. So if we have no further questions, we've had the recommendations put. You're seconding?
Yeah, I'll second.
All those in favour? Marvellous. Thank you. All right, we then come on to the future Chippenham update. If I take a couple of moments to run through the detail of this and the logic behind it, and then I appreciate we have a lot of questions that we will be coming on to. But I'll start by providing a sort of summary of where we are, or why we've got here, and what it is we're looking at doing. Without dwelling overly long on the history, the HIF project has been a very long time in coming. Was agreed prior to the last election. Post the last election, and looking at the position we were in and the issues around increasing costs at that time, and the potential issues around deliverability and the timescales that we were working to, Cabinet proposed that we look to come up with a revised HIF and discuss that with Homes England. Those discussions have been ongoing for a long time. In July this year, we then agreed to pause any further expenditure because it was clear that we hadn't got to that point of a resolution, and we were concerned again about escalating costs and the implications of continuing to spend money without clarity. We have now finally got clarity from Homes England. That clarity, and just to apologise for the fact this report came out a day after the rest of the Cabinet papers, but there was the last meeting with Homes England was on the Friday prior to that report coming out, which involved the Chief Exec of Homes England, senior officers here, getting that final clarity and that final understanding of what the options were. Homes England are saying to us that the southern section by itself is not something that they are minded to be recommending, minded to be proposing. Whilst it's a ministerial decision to actually go with that or not, it puts us in a position where really we have two options left. One option would be to go back to the initial, the full HIF scheme. That is an option that we've considered in detail, and I think would place the council at extremely difficult financial risk. Since HIF was approved, we've seen massive escalation in building costs. We've seen escalation in materials, and we've now got the cost of living crisis and inflation affecting everything else as well. And we don't have precise figures as to what it would mean for the cost of the road, but I think it's not unreasonable to say that we would be looking at placing a massive financial strain on the council, because we would be taking responsibility initially for the entire cost of the road above and beyond the 75 million, and that would be money that we would then need to borrow. We'd be then paying financing costs on it, and it would place us under a strain that certainly I am not comfortable when you look at what has happened in other councils around the country recently with borrowing on projects. It's a position I would not be comfortable placing the council in under those circumstances. The cost escalation has simply been too much. And I think it's really important to understand that, because it really shapes the choice that we have. I suppose we could say we stick with the southern option and roll the dice with ministers, but the clear steer we've got is that there won't be a recommendation for that. Cost escalation has occurred nationally. I'm hearing from other leaders of councils all over the country that their HIFs are equally in the same position, where they are finding that there isn't enough funding. There is a limited pot that Homes England have, and they need to make sure that that funding is focused into schemes, perhaps half the schemes that were initially proposed, because of the escalation of costs. It's been that severe. So then that leaves us with the final option, the option that we are proposing today, which is to withdraw from the scheme under the terms listed. What that would mean in simple numerical terms to the council is that we would take on 1.8 million of the costs. In essence, all the costs incurred prior to the exploration of the southern route only would be borne by Homes England. The costs incurred after that would be split. And at that point, we would end the agreement. I'll come into a little more detail on what that means in a second. From a risk perspective to the council, that is clearly a far less risky option. However, it does mean, and one of the great drivers behind the HIF was the desire to deliver infrastructure-led development. And we've tried to maintain that with the southern idea, and I think it causes all of us concern to think that we would be in a position where we're not aiming to or able to provide that infrastructure-led development. I think the cookie-cutter development we've had has not been good, and we really, if possible, we need to find a way to continue with that. I think the other thing to bear in mind with this is that we have two processes running at the same time. We as a council have the HIF agreement, and I've explained the economic rationale and the risk to that. We've also got the local plan. The local plan runs entirely independently to this process. The local plan will provide evidence-based allocations. Before I proceed, I'm going to ask Nick to just summarise the position from a local plan perspective, and then I'll come back to talk through the detail of what it is we're suggesting around HIF today. And it really is important that we separate those, because they are two absolutely distinct processes.
Thank you, Richard. I think the first thing to say is to outline a little bit about the local plan process, which is ongoing. And of course, we've got a paper later on about the timescale for the local plan update, which we'll obviously be looking at. But one of the main things that comes out of the local plan process is the allocation of housing, and that has to be done in a way which is, as Richard says, totally evidence-based. And I can't preempt what that is going to come up with. The process is the process, and the first public airing of that will be when the draft plan is available, as per the paper on the local development scheme. That will be available next year. and I think it is very difficult for us because you have to separate these things. There can be no muddying of the waters, and the southern area will only go ahead if it is, the evidence suggests that it should do. It is totally evidence-led, this process, and that's where we are.
And equally, any other area put forward in the HIF will only, it will be prioritised based on the evidence and the assessment of that evidence through the local plan process. It will not be, it's not a decision that is made by us as councillors. It's a decision that is made through a very clearly defined process. Right, if I come back then to the detail of what it is we are asking to look at today. What we're asking is that council, or that we agree to council withdrawing from the HIF programme based on the mutually agreed exit from the grant determination agreement with Homes England, and then to delegate authority to Andy in consultation with myself to deal with any final documentation required to do that. That subject to agreeing to that withdrawal, Cabinet refers the recommendation to full council that the unfinanced costs are funded through future capital receipts. I'll come on to some detail there in a minute. That subject to seeking a withdrawal from the HIF programme, Cabinet recommends a budget allocation of £500,000 next financial year to be funded by borrowing to support the work to promote the council sites in the local plan review as part of the council's capital programme's budget setting process. And we're referring there specifically to the southern sites because they're the ones that we are dealing with under this proposal. That's the area we're looking at now. I'm not commenting on any other sites, simply on the proposals that we're putting forward in relation to where we'd got to with the HIF. Subject to withdrawal from the HIF programme, Cabinet agrees from the removal of future HIF programme budgets funded by grant, and that we agree to continue work with landowners to the south of Chippenham, adjoining the council's land holdings to achieve site allocations for council-owned sites in the local plan review as part of an overall master plan to try and keep that infrastructure-led development. And then to agree to enter into a legal agreement to allow access to the Rawlings Farm development via council land at Darcy Close and the Cycleway, and agree to delegate authority to the Corporate Director of Resources in conjunction with, or to Andy in conjunction with myself, into entering into any such legal agreement. So if I come on to the position we are and what that means if going ahead with this. There's been a lot of work that's gone into looking at the viability of what could be delivered in that southern section, a lot of technical work. This is work that would need to be carried out as part of the creation of a proposal to allocate those sites into the local planners in the same way any other landowner or collection of landowners would do when they're working up their own plans. And so the work that has happened isn't wasted. It's work that that is there, that can be used and can be used as part of that southern section. We're working with landowners there to bring that forward as a local plan allocation site. As Nick has said, other allocations will be brought forward. They will be decided on collectively. It'll be decided on the evidence and on their merits. But the reason that we are looking at asking for further funding there is that there is still some work that will need to be done to draw that proposal together and then put that forward to the local plan process and make sure it's a properly delivered scheme. We've looked at various other options. They're highlighted on page 23. One option was to do nothing, which is theoretically the least costly to us, but that gives up any scope of infrastructure-led development. It gives up any attempt to try and create that larger delivery for Chippenham, that larger provision that provides some of the things that we are hearing from Chippenham, from the people of Chippenham, that they want in terms of infrastructure. We could explore alternative land use proposals on the southern land. There have been various suggestions around leaving it, well, potentially putting a form of renewable energy generation or other uses on it. Again, on balance, it was felt that that was probably not the best way for us to proceed at the moment. We could look at disposing of some of that land, which would be a relatively simple way of covering the costs that we've got. But again, it would be giving up that chance of infrastructure-led development. We really don't want to be doing that. And then we can work with landowners to the south of Chippenham collectively to try and get that combined proposal. On balance, certainly on the scoring that officers have done, and on balance from our discussions as Cabinet, I think we feel that that's the most appropriate way to go forward. Therefore, that is what we are proposing to do today. I think that probably covers everything I wanted to cover in terms of comments. Is there anything else from Cabinet? Anything I've missed? No? So in which case, we've had a number of questions in relation to this item. So before I open it up to everyone's scrutiny and then other members, I'll follow through the questions that we've had in Agenda Supplement 2. And for those attending, I'll see if we've got any supplementaries. Mel Boyle, I gather, is not with us. So then we have Owen Inskip. Owen, you are with us. Do you have supplementaries?
Thank you. I've asked 8 carefully worded written questions to the council, specifically as landowner, as to why they are doing what they are doing. Why is this ongoing determination to develop to the south of Pewsham with a southern road without giving any consideration to the reasonable alternatives? I've received no single meaningful answer. And why? I wonder why. It's the same problem tearing the Conservative Party to pieces nationally. The Conservatives will not be thrown out by the NIMBYs they're so scared of. They'll be thrown out by the millions of people under 40 who have no chance of owning a home and can barely afford the rent. We need more houses, and whilst this could be resolved by strengthening housing targets, we have 56 MPs in Westminster doing their best to weaken or remove them altogether. And who's in the thick of it? Our local anti-development hero, James Gray. And so we have the same problem here on a local level. James and Ashley O'Neill are telling you that going east will cost more Conservative votes than going south, and you believe them. And I should add that Ashley was a keen supporter of the Eastern Link Road and development to the east of Chippenham when he was a Conservative, when he was a councillor in Chippenham, and I have emails here to prove it. I've known James for 30 plus years. He's a friend. He calls me a sleazy developer, and I call him an old Tory dinosaur. It would be quite funny until it ceases to be funny. It's interesting that James and his cabal of comfortable Conservative supporters were letting it be openly known around the dinner table in early July last year that they'd saved the Marden. James himself told me, with a knowing wink, it's sorted. Sorry, old boy, no development in the east. Now, the Cabinet papers were not even out when those conversations took place, and you have to wonder why he and his friends had such confidence. But we know the answer, I think. The week after the Cabinet decision, he writes to his supporters a congratulatory note, congratulating the Council. They listened to the voters, as has been demonstrated by their abandonment of the ghastly eastern bypass around Chippenham and the 7,500 houses it would have meant. It would have been an outrageous invasion of the countryside. The people rose up against it, and I congratulate the Council for bidding it. The new proposal, a southern bypass, makes good sense. How can it possibly make good sense to develop to the south, but not to the east? Why? It makes no sense at all. Anyone that knows the land will know that the southern landholding, in terms of perspective, in terms of landscape, is every bit as beautiful, arguably considerably more beautiful than the land in the east. So why? It makes no sense at all. It can't be good sense. But we know the answer, don't we? The south is outside James's constituency, which stops at the A4. Now, how shallow is that? And how shallow was your decision last July? If you persist, be in no doubt your plan will fail at the examination in public. And there'll probably be a wasted further...
Sorry, Owen, I'm going to interrupt you at this point. You're conflating two issues here, and I'm really quite concerned about that. We are talking about dealing with the HIF allocation, the HIF grant, and how we resolve that. This is not about the local plan. So I really want to be very clear to anyone listening that your comments about local plan failing, I have no idea what the local plan will propose. I have no idea which sites. I have no doubt that a number of landowners will bring in sites and will put them forward for development. The local plan will decide that based on evidence. What we are trying to address here is financial risk to the council and how to proceed. I'll come in with further responses when you finish, but please can we not conflate the local plan and this?
I get you, and I understand. So you want to, as landowner, spend another £500,000 as landowner on top of the 12 million that has been spent already of public money, which is now gone. You want to spend £500,000 as landowner to promote your land in the south. Is that the right thing to be doing with public money? To, as landowner, specifically promote that landholding in the south? My question for you, Leader, please. I asked 8 very carefully worded questions, written questions. They're all there on the public record. Every single one of those questions very specifically asks the question to Wiltshire Council as a landowner. So pray tell me, why does the answer come in the name of Councillor Bottrell? You say, and Nick himself says in his, what he said earlier, there must be no muddying of the waters. So I asked 8 questions to the council as landowner, and I get a response from the cabinet member responsible for spatial planning. That makes no sense. So my question is,
Sorry,
one
I'll
last
clarify
time-
that one for you now. The response should have been in both myself and Councillor Bottrell's name, because your questions stray between the two. Sorry, that was something we didn't pick up until yesterday, but it should have been in both our name, which is why I'm initially responding to you, and Nick will probably come in after, but yes.
Okay, so my question, I'm sorry it's taken a long time to get there. One last time, why are you, as landowner, so intent on developing to the south of Pewsham, and why do you believe, as landowner, as an important local landowner, that that is right for the town centre, and the people of Chippenham? That's all I want to know. I've been a Conservative all my life. I want to support you, but how can I if you won't tell us the answer?
Right, thank you. If I sort of comment, and then if Nick and probably Ashley, given that he's been referenced, want to come in further on. Firstly, this has nothing to do with Conservative Party politics. Let's be really clear. The decision that was made after in July 2021 was around the risks that we were facing and the difficulties with delivery and the requirements to bring something forward inside timescales that would work for Homes England. And that's why we decided at that point, as is clearly laid out in the papers, the cabinet papers that came forward there, that is why that decision was made. So it's not about party politics. I have no idea. I agree, in my experience, James Gray is probably opposed to any house that wasn't already in place by about 1750. He's firmly on the record as having his views there, but those are his views. They're not the views of this council. And certainly, this is not something that has been dealt with inside the realms of Conservative Party politics. We are looking at this from the perspective of the council, our own risks, and the aim to try and deliver infrastructure-led development. As I've iterated, where will be developed is down to that local plan process, and landowners put land forward, as you are doing and as many other landowners are doing as part of the local plan process across the entire county. This paper is dealing with what we are looking at doing with that southern section, having proceeded further with that based on the cabinet decision from July, which there were judicial reviews, it was felt to have been made in an appropriate way. So we were looking in this paper now at how we continue to try and deliver infrastructure-led development in that area. It's got no comment on what will happen with any other sites around Chippenham, on whatever ever other parts of that process will be carried forward. So all I'm doing in this paper is setting out the next steps in that area, dealing with the work that's gone on so far and how that can be brought to fruition for a submission in the local plan. As I've said, there will, I have no doubt, be a lot of other submissions brought forward, and it'll then be down to that process to resolve. Nick, again, if you can reiterate about how that process will carry itself out, please.
Well, you've said it. I mean, that process will either demonstrate that the southern sites are viable in some form or other, or any other sites, as you've referred to, including those to the east, and that will become apparent. The results of that, and stress again that I don't know the results of that process. That process is not concluded yet. That will be apparent in mid next year. So, you know, to the answer why, well, we shall see whether it's sustainable and whether the evidence stacks up or the evidence doesn't stack up. And that from the planning process. There is nothing more really that can be said on that.
I'll come to Ashley if you want in 1 second. Just the other point I will make to specifically answer your question. Why are we looking at moving forward with the southern sites in this paper? It's because we are still looking to try and deliver that infrastructure-led development. I need to keep reiterating that. Ashley, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll probably just add that I mean, all of us would prefer infrastructure-led development where we possibly can. Of course, I was interested in that government investment in Chippenham when I was councillor there, but I wasn't involved in the detail of how that was all put together. So I don't think it's fair to say that I supported one thing or another, and obviously events have moved on significantly since 2017/2018. And we've clearly heard today about the costs of all this, financial risks, and what's important is where we are now. But this is very much about HIF and not local plan. That is an entirely separate process.
Right. If we then move on to questions from Nick Parry. Is Nick here? No. And then Richard Kerr, who I don't believe is here. Stuart Roberts. Helen Stride. Helen, do you have a supplementary?
Yes, just a couple, if that's okay. I'll ask them both at the same time, and one does relate to the local plan, but it is a question following the response I've received to a question I asked. So my first question is you know, it is really important, I think, for us to state that £12 million of public money has been wasted. You have said it hasn't been completely wasted, but most of it has been wasted on what I think a number of people consider to be an ill-conceived idea, which was very strongly opposed by the people of Chippenham and unanimously opposed by Chippenham Town Council, and also was subject to a judicial review. I would just like to ask the Cabinet if you're going to apologise for having wasted £12 million of public money, because obviously that's something I think would be necessary. The second question I have is that perhaps is directed at Councillor Bottrell. So in regulation, Local Plan Regulation 18, Wiltshire Council planned to build far more houses across Wiltshire than Wiltshire needed, 20,000 according to a report by CPRE. And you planned to build far more houses than Chippenham needed. And this was something I do believe that Councillor Clue acknowledged in a radio interview, that the houses weren't actually being planned, weren't actually needed. You were at the time meeting government targets. Many of these extra houses were being built in northwest Wilts and on green fields. Therefore, I find it surprising to see on page 36, in response to my question, that the requirement to consider local need is already part of the existing planning process. Well, clearly it was ignored in Regulation 18. Can you please assure us that it won't be ignored in the delayed Local Plan Regulation 19? And just finally, I think it will come as a surprise to a lot of us to hear you say, Councillor Clue, that the people of Chippenham want infrastructure-led development. I was of the understanding that of the 1,000 people who were consulted regarding the HIF, 80% were opposed to any road at all. And I would imagine you are finding that there is now quite considerable amount of opposition to the dualling of the A350 from Bumpers Farm down to Lackham. And one of my questions was, how are you planning to mitigate against the congestion that is obviously going to be created along the A350 from Lackham to Melksham once you've dualled the A350 down to Lackham? And this is surprising you're planning to do that, considering you are supporting plans to build a £200 million bypass around Melksham to address that very problem. So whilst it might not necessarily be the time to talk about the Cabinet's support for the M4 Dorset Coast Connectivity Project, I think at some stage we need to discuss the Cabinet's support for the urbanisation of the A350 corridor, which is where many of these 20,000 extra houses are planned to be built. And that is a road that a highway to nowhere, it's very unlikely that the highway being proposed will ever get any further than Warminster. So it causes me a great deal of concern that the Cabinet is once again supporting, seems to be misguidedly supporting a project that actually is going to fail. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Nick, do you want to deal with any specific local plan issues, and then I'll answer the rest?
Right, on the housing needs, council is now looking at the lower limit for the total number of homes going forward. So that is essentially the lowest that it is considered to be reasonable that the evidence will support. The actual numbers that come forward come from government, essentially, in the first place. And those are based on surveys going back some years. I think they had their genesis in the Barker report, which came up with this figure of 300,000 new homes a year that the country needed to meet the obligations of rising population and demand for housing. I think what you're talking about is the housing need in the different areas and how that plays out. We still have to make a plan which provides for the lower end of the numbers that the government says that we've got to do. So, that is a given. The detail of how that is done is where the evidence on housing need taken locally feeds into the process. And that is part, if we have failed to do that, then our local plan will not pass muster at the stage of inspection. So, it's pretty much a fundamental that we have to get that right.
Trying to then address some of the other points. When this scheme was first put forward, the numbers stacked up just about. It was tight, but it was viable. It was achievable. The costs have escalated to the extent that's the primary reason why we're no longer able to proceed with this. We're not unique. I'm hearing the same things from leaders across the country about the costs of delivering housing infrastructure fund schemes. So is it regrettable that we're in this position? Yes. Do I wish we weren't? To an extent, yes, though we'll come on to the point about housing targets perhaps in a minute, because the ground is moving there as well. And that's also, I think, relevant to how the the whole question should be looked at. So yeah, it's deeply regrettable that we're in a position where we're not able to proceed with this, but the risks, the downside of proceeding is now so severe that it doesn't make any sense to take it further forward. I think your comments about the A350, and Mark isn't here to comment, but I'll sort of try and make the points. Government are looking at the north-south connectivity study. It is extremely slow moving north-south inside Wiltshire. You average a speed of 30 miles an hour, and certainly from my own driving around the county, I would agree it is extremely slow. The idea of improving that flow and taking it out of towns makes sense. So I don't think I accept your view that the A350 dualling is a road to nowhere. It's not just about the dualling of the road, it's about trying to take that traffic away from Melksham, in an ideal world also, away from Westbury. Warminster has you've already then got good connection onto the A36, which then has its own problem at Salisbury, which is also being looked at as part of that scheme. I don't know what National Highways will be bringing forward as proposals, but I don't accept it's a road to nowhere. It's certainly not an urbanisation corridor. And the number of 20,000 homes that you come up with, government sets housing targets for us based on the national need. If we were merely meeting the need of Wiltshire rather than helping to meet the need of the country, as I've said on the radio, yes, the targets would be lower. But that's not the requirements that were set by government. We are set national targets, and we don't actually have any choice about that. There are some suggestions in the emerging changes to the national planning policy coming out, and I'm frantically looking at a file I've got open, the recent letter from Michael Gove about this, and I can't find the relevant section, but there is a section that says that councils that have been over-delivering, and you refer to the CPRE, we have, compared to what's called the housing trajectory, been over-delivering. That doesn't change the fact that the 5-year land supply is the thing that we have to deliver for government. So the fact we've been over-delivering doesn't actually help us in saying we've got enough houses. It's one of two measures government use to determine the amount of housing that an authority has to build. But they are saying that the authorities that have been over-delivering will then be able to reduce targets potentially, and we need to see what happens with that bill in the Commons, but potentially reduce those targets in lieu of the overachievement that's been occurred. I don't know what's going to come out of that. Again, it has to be evidence-led. It has to feed into the local plan process. There are a number of other things there about not building where it's changing character, and I really want to see the detail on that. I think that's going to be extremely complex and difficult to argue. The assumption that simply means that we're going to be able to avoid house building in areas because people say it's going to change character beyond belief. I don't think that's what government's saying. I think there will be some very specific circumstances. They directly reference national parks and greenbelt in that same sentence. So we'll see what comes from that. So we were, as has been pointed out, looking at a proposal that was 5,000 above need. One of the first things that we did when I became leader was ask officers to look at that, to reassess it, and to look at the evidence around meeting the need that was being required from government. And if that need changes, we will have to consider to what extent we adjust accordingly. That need is considered a floor. It's not a ceiling. It's the minimum, however it's defined, that we have to provide. It is possible for authorities to build more, but given that your future need tends to be based on what you've built in the past, I think that you've got to ask serious questions about whether you want to go above and beyond that need, because it simply speeds up that process of house building in an area. I think on the issue of infrastructure-led development, I get the point that when you ask people, do you want lots of houses built near to you, normally the answer is no, although it's not consistently the answer, and certainly the consultations that I've listened to in Chippenham, there have been a number of people who are very much emphasising the fact that infrastructure-led development is what people want to see. What people get really frustrated with are housing developments that are built and then the infrastructure never follows on from them because they're not large enough or because you haven't got that critical mass to provide some of the other things that they want in terms not just of roads, but of appropriate walking and cycling infrastructure, in terms of leisure facilities, support some of the GP provisions, some of the other local facilities that can come with development. I would personally like to see all of our towns being master planned with developers in a more cohesive way where development's going on to understand what the town needs and help provide it. Sadly, the way this game works is that at the moment, developers pretty much have the whip hand, and we do what we can inside the framework government gives us. Hopefully that gives a response to your questions. We could go on for hours on this topic. We really could, and we could all get thoroughly frustrated with national planning policy, I'm sure. I then come on to Councillor Claire Cape. Claire, did you have a supplementary?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'll just pull up the text. I don't think we've taken all the questions, by the way. I think, I know I'm last, but I don't think Anne Henschel had a.
I think there are other questions that relate to the local plan.
Oh, okay.
I
All
think
right.
we're taking here questions relating to Chippenham,
Thanks.
and then
Okay.
local plan questions will follow.
Okay, so I'll ask all my questions, and perhaps you'd like to take them together as you see fit, if that's okay.
Can we stick to Chippenham at the moment, please,
Yeah,
and come
yeah,
back to
sure.
local
Yeah,
plan
no,
when we get to local
okay.
plan? Because I keep coming back to the point, these are distinct and separate issues. I know that's really hard to, the line is quite frustrating between them, shall I say.
I understand, but the thoughts are inextricably linked, even though the answers may not be. So it is a bit challenging. Anyway, on my question one, my supplementary question is: thankfully, Homes England has chosen to withdraw from this ill-conceived project. Will there be an opportunity for a wash-up so lessons can be learnt from this? My second question. I don't think that that's about the local plan. Do you want me to come back to that one?
Please,
Yeah, okay. Question 3 is also a local plan.
Yeah,
Um,
thought it was just the first one. But
four,
was-
4 is local plan, really.
I think the rest of them are probably ones we come back to on the local plan, aren't they?
No, the 5th one. Okay, I'll put question 5 in local plan as well. Then I'll just say it's just that first one. Will there be a wash up, and will we learn lessons? Thank you very much.
We've certainly already had a lot of discussion and a lot of sort of analysis of to what extent this could have been predicted on what lessons we could learn. I haven't got any plans formally for that, but I do think we need to make sure that as an authority, we understand what the risks ended up being here, why they ended up being where they were, so we can make sure that in the future, we're properly assessing that as part of the process. I don't think anyone predicted inflation in its various forms in quite the way that we've had it. It's not been, I mean, for what, 30 years? We haven't really seen this, no, probably even longer, for this degree of both building and then the general inflation. But yeah, we with anything like this, we need to make sure that appropriate lessons are being learned. By all means, do come back on that.
I'm going to come back very briefly. My thinking around that question was the engagement or lack of with the community around Chippenham, and can we, as a council, politicians of all colours, perhaps come together and think about how we properly co-create some of these ideas, because Chippenham was absolutely done to through this whole process. That's what led to the bitterness and anger that we are living with now. So that was the element of the lessons learned that I hoped would be quite high in Cabinet's mind in terms of what lessons can we learn. And let's do that in an inclusive way, please. Thank you very much.
I personally think that's a very fair point. I think the entire planning process does to people rather than engages with them. The idea of infrastructure-led development is to try and engage with people. I would certainly agree that the initial proposals didn't have that effect. I think it would have been beneficial had they been discussed prior to a HIFBIG going in, personally. I don't think it would have taken the heat out, in all honesty, but I think it would at least have made sure everyone understood what was being considered and that there was a better degree of debate and understanding. I think the problem with anything, and when we actually come to seeing a local plan in front of us from past experience, the moment we see it, people stop thinking about the bigger picture and the policies and all of the sort of important elements about shaping places for the future and just get stuck on, my goodness, don't build there. So I don't think there will ever be a perfect way of doing that. But I think the points you make are well made, yes. Right, if I then come to overview and scrutiny at that point. Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I give one on the Environment Select Committee's notes on this one from Councillor Derek Clunkler, I think I gave you the wrong date on the previous one for Silverwood, in that Children's Select Committee were briefed on the 8th of December, not in November, by officers and the Cabinet member on that one. I'd just like to correct that. Thank you. I've got a statement here from Councillor Derek Clunkler. They were briefed yesterday, the 12th of December, on this issue. The briefing considered the reasons for the exit from the Grant Determination Agreement, GDA, and its potential impact upon the scale and timescales of any development. Also considered the effect of the withdrawal and the effect of not exiting the agreement on the Council's finances. The identified options available to future Chippenham were also discussed. On balance, the decision to mutually exit from the GDA and the recommended option to continue to work with landowners are ones which the Chairman and the committee would support. This is clearly going to be a longer-term programme, and the Select Committee would welcome further updates when appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. If I then turn to Ian.
Yes, thank you, Richard. And having moved from item 6, which was about Christmas cheer, we moved to item 7, which appears to be very much in the bleak midwinter, I think. And I'm really quite cautious not to enter into the Conservative Party inter-party warfare that seems to have taken place in this meeting, which I think is most unfortunate. I
think you're referring to comments from a member of the public, not about warfare inside the party. I've been very clear, and I'll continue to be.
Well,
Cabinet is making decisions based not on party politics, but based on.
Richard, I'm going to leave it at that.
Sorry, Ian. No, you won't. I'll finish my explanation, because you're trying to throw political jibes into something where we're sitting here trying to make decisions based on the risks faced by this council and the right way to address those, alongside the need to be making sure that housing is coming forward in line with the targets we're getting, and that, yeah, I think we need to be really clear about that.
Richard, I'm just reflecting on what, Richard, I'm sorry.
They're not comments from this administration.
I think it's very clear what we all heard, Richard. I'm not going to go any further, but it's very clear what is happening on this issue.
No, it isn't, Ian. I will be crystal
party.
clear. This cabinet is making decisions based on our assessment of the risks faced by this council and the position that we are in as an authority, with the competing demands we have of the need to meet government housing targets, the local plan process, which is distinct, and the position we'd got to with the financial risks that we were facing with the HIF bid.
Can I continue?
By all means, but if you keep coming back on the point, I will keep reiterating the answer.
I'm going to continue, if I may.
Please
Richard.
do.
So just picking up on comments that other members of the public made, and can I just make a point about the importance of residents here and the importance of campaigns here and the importance of listening to local residents. I think that this council has an appalling record when it comes to listening to residents, whether it's on this or indeed other issues. And I think often there's an awful lot of knowledge and know-how and competence and insight that this council could do well in terms of listening to when it comes to matters that concern communities. And I think this is a perfect example of that. As we've already heard, this council has helped the taxpayer lose we're heading towards about £10 million. And it does seem to me that if that's not a reason for you to apologise, Richard, on behalf of this council, I'm not sure what is. And I accept the fact that this was an initiative, let's be charitable, that began with your predecessor, possibly your predecessor's predecessor. But I do think you're the person on the watch at the moment. Here we have a local authority stepping into the world of development with little or no expertise, and we've seen this happen with other local authorities elsewhere, without the resources to do so, without the important, what I would describe as spread, which developers have, where they have a range of developments, some that succeed and some that fail. So without the equipment to do the job, and I do hope, even if you're not willing to apologise, you may accept that this isn't the type of area with the expertise and the finance that's required that local authorities should get into. And given the amount of public money that you and your cabinet and indeed this council have lost, I hope that you'll reflect on that in any future wash-up that was referred to by Councillor Cape. And I do just want to press the point that Councillor Cape made, that yes, I've no doubt there have been difficult conversations within this council, but I do think these sort of decisions that affect people's lives, that have cost people money, that have lost money for the taxpayer, these should be discussions that are much more publicly available because we all have an interest. They shouldn't take place behind closed doors. They should be open and accessible and transparent. And I have to say, Richard, I'm very disappointed, given the enormity of this issue, that there's been no debate from your cabinet this morning. I know you have what I always describe as the secret cabinet every Monday morning. But again, I would be grateful if members of your cabinet would express a view. We've heard from Ashley, and Ashley's been brought in to the conversation already. But I think that this is an opportunity where cabinet should be engaging with the public, with the taxpayers, at a public gathering that we have this morning. Now, we've learnt some things this morning, which I think are quite fascinating. We've learnt, but please, Richard, I know you'll correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, I certainly will.
I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will. That we've just discovered that Homes England would not provide the funding unless both the east and the southern sections, the whole 7,500 unit scheme, was to be progressed. Now, is it absolutely true we've just discovered that, given that you've been promoting a southern section only since the elections took place last year? And are we absolutely clear that we've just discovered that we would have to fund the additional costs over the 75 million that was originally provisionally outlined, whatever words you want to use, committed by Homes England? So it just seems to me extraordinary that we are now, I don't know, 18 months, 2 years plus into this whole process, but we've just discovered that the HIF funding would be withdrawn if we don't proceed with the whole of the scheme. I'll let you come back to me on that if you would now, Richard.
No, you carry on with all your questions and I'll then come back in. Go on.
And let me just touch on a couple of other points, if I may. Paragraph 22, there's a reference to a reasonable amount of control of our design. In other words, we can still continue with this. It's all okay, and we'll have whatever the word reasonable relates to in terms of development, a reasonable amount of control of the design of whatever may come forward, given the decision that Cabinet's already decided to make on this in relation to this paper. And I just have to say that that's so extraordinarily naive. What's been very clear about this entire process is the naivety. And I'm not going to blame officers. This is a wholly political initiative led by Richard Kluwer, led by Philip Whitehead, possibly Baroness Scott, depending on how you judge the process that's taken place. So we have had naivety all the way through. There is no reasonable amount of control that will take place as landowner, because if you get to a point where the land is allocated, you will sell to a house builder, and the house builder will build based on their house types. That's the way the system works. And I have to say, and it's been very evident, particularly in relation to the questions that we'll hear a little bit later from Councillor Cape, the inherent conflict that is taking place in relation to Wiltshire Council's role as a promoter of its own land and its role in relation to delivering a local plan. And that's not really a criticism of the system, it's simply the way the system works. And I have to say, given that I think I'm right, again, you'll correct me, Richard, if I'm wrong, that we'll get to a point at full council where full council will be asked to accept or otherwise the site allocations. And are we suggesting at that point, assuming that some of Wiltshire's land is allocated, that all members of the Cabinet will leave that debate given the conflict that's taken place between you as a Cabinet promoting the land as landowner and we as a council having to judge the merits of a local plan and indeed the site allocations? So I think there are tremendous problems that should have been, if they weren't identified in relation to the inherent conflict when this whole process started. And let me just complete by saying this. This is an initiative that should never have happened in relation to Wiltshire's role as a promoter of land. Local authorities don't have the expertise or the experience or the funds, as we've discovered this morning, to deliver these sorts of complicated schemes. And can we have an acceptance from you, Richard, assuming people can actually hear the live stream this morning, that this is not an initiative and a process that this council will engage in the future. And for the millions of pounds of taxpayers' money, even though we're only picking up a relatively small amount, the taxpayer, as always, picks it all up, that you will apologise to taxpayers on behalf of this council for the amount of money you and this council have lost.
Right, thank you. And sadly, I don't think you're listening to everything that's being said. I certainly don't think you've been listening over the course that this has been running for. Had you been, you would be very clearly aware that it was an initiative that was started by Jane and not wondering where it was started. But coming on to the idea of money being lost, let's be clear, money has been spent, that money is not lost. The money has been spent because in bringing forward proposals, bringing forward particularly the vast bulk of it on highways work that can then be used or will be used as other developments are put forward inside the local plan process. And I suppose whether you would define whether it's been lost or not may well depend on whatever allocations are made at that stage. But even then, I don't think we'll get to see any slowing down of well, we might say slowing down. We're not going to see a ceasing of the need to build houses moving forward. So the money isn't lost. What can't proceed is the scheme as it stands. Now, you were suggesting that we just found out that there would be additional costs required. We've known from the beginning, again, if you'd read any of the papers going back to when this started, which clearly you didn't, that there was always going to be additional cost above and beyond the 75 million. The aim was for that money to be recouped as houses were then built through the Section 106 and planning process. Clearly, you're too busy tweeting to want to actually listen to what's being said, but doesn't surprise, I guess. And what we have found as that process has gone on is that as the costs of the road have escalated, it's become more and more marginal. The onus on the council has become greater and greater to the extent that that risk has become unacceptable. Initially, it was viable. 3 years ago, it was becoming tricky, but it was still felt that it would make sense. Now, following the runaway inflation that we've had, both in building materials, I'm reiterating the point again, building materials, and then in the actual cost of living and inflation generally, it has now got to a point where we feel it is beyond prudent to continue on that basis with the HIF scheme, because all the onus would fall on the council for that extra funding. And that's always been the case. The difference is, initially, we were talking about a combined road scheme being, I don't know, if I think back about 135, I think million were numbers that were being mooted initially, 75 million of which would come from HIF. Now it is significantly greater. So it's always been the case. There's nothing new there. What's happened is events have escalated outside of anyone's control. And as a result, we're at a point where we simply I think that the risks we would incur from proceeding with the entire scheme are too great. You ask when we found out from Homes England and their precise position. As I explained, the last meeting on this with the Chief Executive of Homes England and people on their side and senior officers was the Friday before the report was published. So that was when we had our final clarity on this. And we've been looking to find ways of progressing and ways to continue to deliver infrastructure-led development. Initially, they were clear that they couldn't make any guarantees, but that they would want to continue a dialogue. And I think it's become really clear to them that building costs, and we're back to the same point, have escalated to such an extent that they are not able to fund all the HIF projects that they have across the country, and so are looking to withdraw from some and put the funding that they've got, because government is not giving them any extra funding, into letting the others proceed. So hopefully that explains to you the position. Might be worth reading papers over time moving forward, because then you wouldn't need to be perhaps asking some of those questions, but okay. In terms of control of design, you're making an assumption that the council would, and I've no idea what we would do were there to be an allocation, that we'd sell to a developer. I've no idea how we would proceed at that point. I've no idea what options there would be, but you're making assumptions that aren't necessarily guaranteed. In terms of when this process comes through full council, certainly as the local plan proceeds, we will need to take very clear advice from Perry. I don't know if Perry wants to give an opinion on that at this point. I appreciate you may not, given the circumstances. We don't have all the clarity there yet, but we will need to be very clear in taking advice from our legal officers to understand what that position is, where we all sit inside it. But when it comes to a local plan, yeah, there's always that tension, those issues that come up. There's always that concern. The local plan process is one that does come to full council, but it is evidence-led. It is not evidence-led on the basis of where we want to sit as a developer. The council owns land all over the place. We have no idea what allocations will come forward at this time. I don't know, is there any clarity at this point, Perry, on that?
Well, what I would say firstly is that we've taken advice from leading council on the position that we find ourselves in. It's not unique to Wiltshire, and you'll appreciate that across the country where councils are the senior planning authority and also have skin in the game in terms of land, that is quite acceptable. The law is able to cope with councils having two roles. We have, last time I checked, about 700 things that we do as an organisation. In terms of conflict, conflict has been also spotted from the outset. We've developed a clear protocol between officers and members that deals with those two elements, so the landowner element and the local planning authority element as well. And when we get to full council, I'll ensure that clear advice is given to all participants. But in certainly my position as I speak is that members of Cabinet don't have any personal disclosable pecuniary interest as to why they can't be part of the decision making, but I'll ensure that all members are clear at how the process follows through. And it's a great question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Can I come back on a couple of points if I...
Very briefly.
I'll be very, very brief. Very, very brief indeed. The 2 points are these. One that I raised, in fact, both I raised in my first contribution, and that is just coming back to the discussions with Homes England and your announcement this morning that Homes, and let's be as, I'm sure you'll be as helpful as possible in terms of the clarity here, that Homes England told this authority that one of the reasons why they wouldn't continue or wish to withdraw from the funding was because this council did not want to proceed with the entire scheme, the east
No, that isn't what
and
I
the
said.
south.
What Homes England said is that just to reiterate the point, that they were, we'd signed an agreement that could be continued with for the entire scheme, that their recommendation would be that were we putting forward, were we wanting to continue with the southern section, their recommendation to the ministers who make the final decision would be that's not something that they would be supporting, but it'd be a ministerial decision to make, or that we can proceed as discussed here.
And therefore, my question is, was this something that we discovered in the most recent round of discussions? Or was this something that we were aware of when this council took the decision last May to
No, I can be
withdraw
absolutely,
to the south
I know
of the
I can be
town?
absolutely clear. That was when we were making decisions then, no, we were not aware of the detail. There have been discussions going on with Homes England over the last couple of months about possible exits, but we didn't have that final clarity until Friday.
And therefore, that inevitably leads me to ask the question, did we not ask Homes England last May what their attitude would be if this authority decided to reduce the ambition of the scheme to what my colleague, Councillor Kate, would describe as half a HIF?
We asked them back in July 2021, and again, as I said earlier today, their assessment there was that they couldn't give a definitive answer, but they were very happy to explore that. That exploration has continued. The national picture, we're back to inflation, has completely changed that picture because they have the same pot of money and they are now needing to make sure that that is focused on delivery of whatever schemes can be delivered, and it means they can't proceed with the escalation of costs that they've had for schemes across the country.
Thank you. And my final question is, given the loss of, let's say, let's round it to about 10 million quid.
There is no loss of money.
Well,
The work has gone on
give-
around the highways work in particular for the development, the potential development of schemes there. So I don't accept the use of the term loss. I simply don't.
Well, okay, let me read, to be helpful, this is my final point before you will want to move on, I accept. Given that a lot of work has taken place, which has cost approximately £10 million, which is wholly at risk should the land that this council owned not be taken forward through the local plan, inherently, again, I take Perry's point about technical conflict, but nonetheless, it still concerns me. Given that we are now risking 10 million quid on the prospect of our horse coming in and the land being allocated, it just seems to me that in itself requires an apology.
Again,
to the
it
people
would
of
be so
Wiltshire.
helpful if you'd read the actual papers when this was first put forward. It was always crystal clear that all of the work on HIF was subject to approvals in the local plan that would come later. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed in that regard. The HIF was always entered into on the understanding that if allocations didn't come forward in the local plan, which is an entirely separate process, then the HIF would not be able to proceed. So that was the understanding from the beginning.
And therefore, and this is my final point.
Final
point. There were 2 points, but they kind of interlink, Richard, because this is so important. And again, assuming that people can hear this discussion at home.
Yes, people can.
This
hear
is
the discussion, have been able to for some time.
And of course, this is a discussion that will go on now for months and years, but nonetheless, and has done for so far. And so it just seems to me, what has changed? Well, I suppose 2 things, really. One is that, in a sense, all the advice, and it takes me back to the points that Our Lady has gone, that were made earlier. There were so many voices suggesting, including mine, and again, you can go back through the papers and assuming that minutes have been taken, it'll be there, about the inherent weaknesses, both structurally in terms of timescale, that this process was going to have to deal with. And I suppose my final point in terms of what's changed is fundamental, and that is that this council is now withdrawing from the deal, and that has changed. And nobody could disagree, surely, that that's a very fundamental change to a process that was moving forward. I'll leave it at that, Rich, for the time being. Thank you.
I would. Virtually nothing has changed in terms of most of the context you're talking about the risks that were known going into the process, that they were all very clearly spelled out at the time. I would agree, we prove this in a second, that there is a significant change there in that we are saying the risks to this council are too great financially to continue, and therefore we are looking at a way to withdraw from it, but we are also then looking at a way to try and ensure that some form of infrastructure-led development can be continued. Yeah, that would be fair. On that point, I think we can at least agree. Right, if I then move on to any further questions from members present. Ross, I'll start with Ross as chair of the area board. then Helen.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, Councillor Ross Henning, Chippenham, Loudon and Rowden, Area Board Chair and Chair of the Local Highways Group. I can't believe this. Where do I start? Do I start when I was a child? My father telling me about the bypass that was pegged out in the 60s around the east of Chippenham. No, I don't want to go back that far. I just think that this whole thing has been handled very badly. I'm sorry, Richard, but I think it has. I think most people in the room would know that I've always been in favour and support an eastern route around Chippenham. I've lived in Chippenham all my life. I know it like the back of my hand. I know the problems with rat running, cross-town traffic. A road to the east of Chippenham, be it the eastern section or the southern section. I don't care which it is. I just want to get the traffic out of the town centre of Chippenham. Of course, that will come associated with housing. And that's one thing where I think, you know, you've gone wrong. I think going for that whole section, right from Wavin down to Lackham, all in one hit with advertising 7,000 houses. You present that to the people of Chippenham, what do you expect they're going to say? No way, 7,000 houses, even if it is over 30 years. I've watched Chippenham grow. I was there before Monkton Park was there. And that's been there a long time. I was there before Pewsham was there. Seapham Park was there. I know the towns grow. We all know towns grow. We all know what we have to deal with. We all know we have to build houses for the people who don't have houses. And especially in Chippenham, people come from all over the country to live in Chippenham because it's such a nice place and it has so many benefits, which is one of the problems. So I think, you know, going for that whole section, well, you bit off more than you can chew. And today's situation shows that very well because it's all fallen to bits. Prices going up. Gosh, is anybody surprised? You use that argument, Richard. I don't know why. I mean, prices go up. Yes, they do. But so, how can that be? I know it's relevant, but it's not that relevant, not in the grand scheme of things. And I've had, when was it? I came to this, the first meeting I came to when I was re-elected 6 years ago was the draft Chippenham site allocations plan. And I voted against it because in that plan, there was no mention of an eastern distributor, link, bypass, whatever word you want to use for it, the roads around to the east of Chippenham. So I've always made myself clear on this. I am disappointed that all this is failing. I think you probably tried to do too much too quickly. I think also the build-up to this. I mean, it's been known for years. Anybody in Chippenham will know for years that the east of Chippenham will be developed at some stage. But it was never spoken about. If this had been led in over a period of time, and you did mention about having what lessons can be learned. How can we better do this? How can we better engage over a long period of time, not just come along? I remember Jane Scott at Chippenham Town Council coming along. It was a secret meeting. We were only invitees only when this was first told to us. And it was all kept so quiet. You need to talk about things. You need to bring it out there.
Ross, is there a
Do you want
question? Is there a
Yes,
question?
I do have a
somewhere
question.
please?
I do have a question, but I also wanted to make my point clear. As a long-term, somebody who's grown up and knows Chippenham, who knows that the only way Chippenham will become a better place is to have its heart put back into it, which was ripped out in the 60s. And the way to do that is to take the traffic out of the town centre. Now, I don't care whether Owen's here, he's campaigning for the eastern section. I've only got to
Ross,
know Owen recently.
can we please come to a question?
And all right then, okay, I'll cut to the chase. When do you imagine that there will be some form of relief road to the east of Chippenham so that Chippenham can start to develop its town centre without having every car that goes from the east to the west and the west to the east goes round the Bridge Centre roundabout and New Road, Marshfield Road, etc., etc., etc.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To answer that specific question, I think that's going to depend on local plan site allocations, which will then determine to what extent houses are being built and roads will be coming with housing. I think that will be entirely down to the evidence that goes into the local plan, which is exactly where we were before all of this. None of the HIF would ever proceed without a local plan allocation. I think the ground has shifted significantly in terms of government's requirements and housing targets, which does create all sorts of uncertainty. And I look forward to seeing precisely what government are going to say when it comes to that planning policy, because it will be really relevant. I do think you perhaps need to have a word with your leader about development in Chippenham. Ian was suggesting that we should listen to what the people say. Well, the people were, as has been pointed out in the consultation, were very clear about no, don't build houses. I'm more inclined to some of the comments you're making in that housing is going to come and it needs to come therefore in the best way possible. I think that politicizing house building is really dangerous for all of us because we either end up with house building that is, well, you see what the government's doing now, where we have some assumptions that this means there'll be no housing targets. No housing targets will mean no house building. That will not be good for anyone. But equally, excessive targets mean house building in a way that people can't accept. And it's a really tricky area because we've got to meet the demands of society that we have, and we've got to meet the social pressures that we've got. So every time you politicize it, it just makes it harder and worse, in my view. Helen.
Thanks, Richard. Helen Belcher for Caution Pickwick. You've got, I don't know whether you've actually acknowledged the point that Helen Stride was making when she said £12 million of public money has been, I won't use lost or thrown away, but spent on this scheme, and effectively we've not got very much to show for it. So do you acknowledge that that is the rough figure, bearing in mind that the council's statement in September on its finances was currently the council is forecasting an overspend of around 12.4 million, but mitigations will reduce it to 6 million, and we've set aside 9 million in reserves. So that's first.
Sorry, Helen, I will come in there because that's
question.
You're talking about different issues. That was the in-year budget position. What we're talking about here is so that was revenue spent during the year, totally unrelated to what we're dealing with here. I would agree that there has been money spent somewhere in the vicinity of, I don't know if maybe Andy can give me the precise figures rather than going for vicinity figures, but that money has not been wasted. That money has been spent and was always being spent on the understanding of local plan allocations. We will see what the local plan allocates, and at that point, we will know to what extent that money is then being used to deliver the roads that have been put forward as part of it or not. But fundamentally that was always the position. What has changed is I'm not willing to see this council put at risk for the extra cost of building a road that would follow through that process and would not be recouped for decades afterwards because of the scale of the building and the scale of the development.
I was merely drawing the comparison between the amount that has been spent on this and the underspend that we have on this.
Well, sorry, they are completely unrelated. The underspend, what you were talking about there, just to clarify, I've got the number, it's 11.984 million so far that has been spent on the HIF scheme. That is in investigating primarily the topography, the ability to build roads to enable development to occur. What you are talking about is about our spending during this year, where the overspend is being caused primarily by pay inflation. It's got nothing to do with Chippenham HIF. They're completely separate issues. That has now been reduced, Nick, to, sorry, you need to put your mic on.
3.77 million.
So that's reduced from the 12. We put 9 million aside to deal with that as a reserve, were it to be required. That was from the underspend in the previous year. That forecast overspend is now down to under 4 million, and I would hope will fall further. But it's nothing to do with HIF. So please let's not conflate the two.
And then moving on, if I understood you correctly, you're proposing the option 4, and you are requesting approval for £500,000, which I'm not entirely sure what that's to be spent on. So is that revenue or capital? And if it's revenue, is this a shift in the council's position to borrow for revenue expenditure?
No, it isn't. It's a request to borrow that money to work up that southern scheme. And if that southern scheme goes ahead, then that's capital. Well, it'll be funded through receipts. Do I have any further questions? Okay, in which case we've got the proposals. Does anyone from Cabinet want to add anything? Sorry, it's been a long discussion. I've been dominating. Go on, Ian, if you want to.
I'd like to just come back in quickly on a more general point, because there were 2 points that were being said earlier that I have to say made me bristle in this. And that was within a question about the suggestion that some kind of party warfare was being played out here. And the second was, and Ian Thorne used the phrase about secret cabinet on Mondays. We meet, we talk about all of these things. And the point I would like to make is that throughout this whole process, and I was in the previous cabinet, my own thinking, my own decisions have been made on the facts and the information available at the time. I think an awful lot of hindsight is trying to be exercised here. And we are coming to a point today, making our decision, and the very timing of the report has come to us finally by the clarity that's come from Homes England. So we are, as a cabinet, dealing with the situation in Wiltshire Council, and the biggest factor in all of this to me is risk, and the risk of the changing finances, etc. So I do want to take that opportunity, take up Ian's invitation to speak as a member of cabinet, that I have throughout this, and I know every other member of the cabinet has dealt with it, information in front of them at that time.
Okay, thank you. Right, we have the proposal in front of us. Proposals in front of us. I've summarised them. I will not read them in detail. We've gone all blurry on the screen. Or perhaps that's just the way I look, I don't know. I'll move those recommendations if I can have a seconder. And all those in favour? Thank you. Right, we now move on to item 8, home care adults recommissioning, pages 23 to 34. Over to Jane.
Thank you very much, Leader. In line with the national situation, Wiltshire has faced unprecedented challenges in providing care at home for people who need it. There are increased numbers of unplaced packages of care. This is primarily due to providers experiencing workforce supply issues combined with the high fuel costs. Earlier this autumn, there has been a national cost of care exercise undertaken for the older people's market, and further information on market sustainability grant to local authorities is pending, which is part of the reason, along with the difficulties in sourcing care, which has led to this paper coming today. Adults home care services have been purchased through the Help to Live at Home Alliance since October 2018, and this will continue until March 2023. A cabinet report in April this year made recommendations which were approved to develop a strategic provider model co-produced with providers to follow on from the Help to Live at Home Alliance. However, since then, Wiltshire providers have continued to experience ongoing challenges, and through market engagement with them, it has become apparent that the fragility of the current market mitigates against transition to this model. So there's been an amendment to our proposals, which, when in the published papers, talk about a 1-year flexible framework with the 1-year extension. However, due to the talking that constantly commissioning do with our providers, and we also work with Wiltshire Care Partnership, there have been 2 sessions, one on the 20th of November and a further one on the 6th of December 22, which clarified providers' clear preference for a 2-year flexible framework plus a potential for a 1-year extension. And I've been advised that that can be made verbally here, and that would lead to a flexible framework covering the period from April 2023 to spring 2026. This report recommends that the Cabinet agrees the following proposals. 1, that adult home care services are purchased through a 2-year flexible framework with the possibility of a 1-year extension. 2, that officers continue to undertake to prepare and complete the tender programme, award and implement a new flexible framework contract for adults home care by the 1st of April 2023, and to delegate authority to approve the new pricing model and associated uplift mechanisms, award a new contract, extension option, and future mini competitions, pilots, and all associated documents to the Director of Procurement and Commissioning in consultation with the Cabinet Member for Adult Social Care, Send and Inclusion, the Corporate Director for People and the Corporate Director of Resources, and the Deputy Chief Executive.
Thank you, Jane. Cabinet members, any comments on this? Yes, Laura.
I fully support this. I think particularly for the need for flexibility, and when I do the children's services one later, it echoes that as well. It needs some nimbleness, and I think that's key here.
Thank you. I mean, I would agree. I think it's very sensible. It makes a lot of, makes perfect sense to me. Any other questions, comments from Cabinet? If I then come to Chris, who I gather is speaking on behalf of Councillor Johnny Kidney at this point.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, just a brief statement to say that Health Select Committee Chair and Vice Chair were briefed on the 31st of October. They provided a detailed briefing and they were fully satisfied with the proposals and with the rationale behind them. They're also happy that there were no financial implications that required dedicated financial scrutiny. Thank you.
Thank you. Ian.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Richard. And can I just say thank you to Ian for his response to my point earlier. I do appreciate the comments that he made. Yes, thank you very much indeed. In terms of the report, I've only got a couple of questions. One is in relation to, there's a phrase in the executive summary, which I think is a very positive phrase in terms of co-production, in relation to co-production with communities, providers, voluntary and health sector partners. And I just welcome some more comment in terms of particularly how the co-production can take place and should take place in relation to communities. And my second point is slightly more broader in the sense that again, the executive summary very accurately, I suspect, and clearly reflects on the market failure that currently exists. And I suppose therefore my question is, and I'm sure the answer is yes, is whether the proposals really do start to address the market failure that currently exists, and putting to one side the issue of co-production, etc., whether we have real confidence that, and this is not meant to be a negative point, but just in terms of helping me to understand where we're going with this, whether we have real confidence that what we can do as one of the players in the marketplace will ensure that the degree of market failure that currently exists can be addressed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I mean, some of what you ask about co-production and the details of that, I'm going to pass to an officer. We have Mel here. But first of all, I mean, we work with Wiltshire Care Partnership, and we have ongoing conversations all the time with providers because we are very aware of our significant role in protecting and nurturing and developing the market. But I'll let Mel give you more details. Market failure, again, we work as closely as we can. There are national drivers. In fact, it's an international problem. I was reading something in The Economist the other day about Denmark and the different changes they're bringing in because it's very difficult to get care provision in a way that is affordable for not just local communities, but for people nationally. But we are doing what we can. Mel, would you like to speak on the...
Of course, addressing the issue of co-production. So we're working closely with communities and community groups through area boards, and that's the work that we want to do in January. But actually talking to people who are being discharged from hospital and their families through Wiltshire Centre for Independent Living and Health Watch. We've already done quite a bit of that.
Sorry, I think we're struggling to hear. Could you perhaps bring the mic down towards you a bit?
Is
should
that
help.
better?
It is.
That's great, thank you. We've also been looking at audits that we've conducted and spoken to carers forums, people who care for people at home around hospital discharge and what would help them to support their families at home and what services. And part of the pilots will be around looking at technology and new resources that we need to develop. At the moment, we have one offer, which is people to come in and support you with your activities of daily living, for example, having a shower or making a sandwich or being able to get outside. But there are issues around social isolation, and we know the impact that that has. We know that we have really rich community resources that we're not engaging properly with yet, and tying into what we are able to offer as not just a council, but as a community of people. So these are the things that we want to pilot. Also looking at a reablement offer so that we work with our providers to train carers so that they can support people to actually improve the way that they function. So it's not just the delivery of care and a one-way trajectory. It's around giving people social support, psychological support, and as well as physical support. And that's the way I think is the only way forward when you look at our demographics, not just for us, but for other parts of the country and the needs that we're going to be having. We need to be starting much sooner and having a range of support offers for people, and also easily accessible, and letting people know about what there is out there.
Thank you. I think that point about the right degree of early support being effectively prevention is, it really is the crux of this. Yeah. Thank you. Any further comments from members? In which case, Jane, you moved the proposals. I'm happy to second. All those in favour? Thank you. I'm going to suggest we take a 5-minute break. We've been running for 2 hours before we continue with the next element. So we will be back here. Well, let's say back here at 5 to 12, please. Right, okay, are we back on? Thanks. Before we come on to agenda item 9, I've got a late, is chair's announcement the right word? A late announcement to just run through. It's some very sad news that I wanted to share. Emma Russell, the head teacher at Kennet Valley Church of England aided primary school, has recently died. Emma was a wonderful inspiration to her staff, pupils, governors, and the whole school community, and she will be greatly missed. She was a real champion for children and families at Kennet Valley, providing years of dedication, having a real passion to help each child fulfill their potential. She just received a long service award after 20 years of service and a commitment to making a difference to her pupils and the whole school community. I'm sure you'll share our sadness at this difficult news. We're supporting the school as they try to come to terms with this difficult loss. We know you'll be mindful of this, but we would ask that you please respect the privacy of the family and school community at this time. If you'd like to send messages of condolence to the school, please email office@kennetvalley.sch.wilts.uk with the subject line condolences. I know that this is something that will be of particular impact to a couple of people in the room who've known Emma for some time. Clearly, very sad news, and just wanted to make sure that was noted and our condolences expressed. If we move on then to agenda item 9, pathway to bed tender. Again, Jane.
Thank you very much. Could I just say that I knew Emma Russell? She taught all 3 of my sons. She was an absolutely wonderful teacher, incredibly dedicated to the children in her care. She was a young woman. She leaves behind a husband and a young daughter, and it's very tragic. Her loss, not just for her family and her friends, but the whole school community, and she'll be very difficult to replace. So that's a small tribute to her. Right, pathway 2. This report is about purchasing new block contracts for the provision of bedded pathway 2 hospital discharge beds and proposes a new hub model, which is currently being piloted in the south of the county. As I'm sure you all know already, patients are discharged from hospital on pathways 0 to 3, and a range of services are commissioned across the pathways to support patients and enable people to remain as independent of formal services and to live well and age well in their homes as possible. Pathway 2 discharges are focused on patients who need a little extra support to return to their usual level of independence at home. This might be through a period of rehabilitation or simply time to recuperate and address any issues preventing a return home. Current Pathway 2 provision are classed as either discharge to assess, D2A, or intensive rehabilitation, IR, and currently consists of beds in a variety of locations. The variety of locations creates several issues. There's inequitable access to therapy, which results in excessive lengths of stay. There's inappropriate placement. There's risk of home closures because many of these beds are in care homes. And this creates an inefficient use of support services. The number of beds currently available for Pathway 2 discharges are managed through block contracts funded from several sources, which have been in addition to the current Better Care funds. The funding from sources other than the Better Care Fund will cease on the 31st of March 2023. When the non-recurrent funding stops, we will need to manage within the recurrent funding available in the BCF, and want to ensure that we have an efficient delivery model to maximise capacity, maximise outcomes for the people involved in using the beds. A review carried out in August 21 proposed a new model of delivering the Pathway 2 beds, which, if successfully delivered, will increase the capacity per bed, make more efficient use of therapy, social care and provider resources, and result in increasing independence and a return home for more patients. A pilot started on the 1st of September to test the hub model. Initial feedback from staff is positive, as is the data about length of stay and outcomes for those patients admitted under the new model. The report recommends a total of 52 beds are purchased in up to 3 hubs across the county, with 1 in the south. This is a reduction in bed provision from the 1st of April 2023, and it's recognised as a potential risk to hospital discharge flow. However, while there is reduced bed availability, if the model works well, the throughput per bed will be increased, the outcomes will be improved, and therefore this will mitigate the risk. We are working closely with health and social care colleagues to really focus on mitigating these risks. So the report makes the following recommendations. 1, that a competition is conducted under the Wiltshire Care Home Alliance to award contracts for the provision of Pathway 2 beds in accordance with the indicative timeline in this report to establish contracts commencing on the 1st of April 2023, and 2, to delegate authority to make decisions connected with the procurement and award new contracts and all associated documents to the Director of Procurement and Commissioning in consultation with the Cabinet Member for Adult Social Care, Send and Inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Along with the need to get people back into their own homes as fast as possible with delayed transfers of care and the blocking of hospital beds, this is the sort of second part of the holy grail of trying to unblock that. I personally take some comfort of the fact that the initial suggestions from the trials we've been running are positive. Again, if I compare it to a national picture, what I'm hearing on more of a national scene is that there have been some issues with this in other areas where they found that staff who've been recruited to run these units, I think on a slightly smaller scale than we're looking at, have merely taken away people who would otherwise be providing domiciliary care. There's no suggestion that's been the case here, which is great. I think it's important moving forward that we monitor to that, because government are very clear about the need to improve discharge. Equally, I think we need to be very clear about it. Certainly from an integrated care system point of view, it's up there as, I don't know, number 1 risk, something close to that. There isn't a formal risk register there, but it would have to be topping those risks out. So I think this is really a really good news story, a good way forward from a Wiltshire perspective. I think we need to be very careful when monitoring it that it delivers and it doesn't have additional knock-on consequences. Any other comments from Cabinet? Thank you. In which case, Chris speaking as Johnny again.
Yes, thank you, Richard. And this is a brief statement from Councillor Johnny Kidney, Chairman of Health Select Committee. On the 30th of November, officers and the Cabinet member provided a detailed briefing on this report for the Chair and Vice Chair of the Health Select Committee. As with the previous item, they were fully satisfied with the proposals and with the rationale behind them. They're also happy that there are no financial implications that require dedicated financial scrutiny at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Ian.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Just a couple of points, and thank you very much for the report. One is, I think that you referred to the pilot in the south of the county and some of the feedback. I couldn't see any feedback from patients, and I just wondered whether there was any feedback from patients and what it was. And then my second point is in relation to the current situation in terms of the number of days. I think the report talks about up to 100 days in this particular part of the process. And I'm just wondering, without spending very much time on this, the inherent relationship between the NHS in terms of their desire to move people out of hospitals and our desire, presumably, to take people when it's appropriate for them to leave hospitals. So I just wanted to understand how that process, without going into a huge amount of detail, how that process works. So it's the 2 points. One is the broader point about that point at which people's care transfers from the NHS to us, and then the very, in some ways, smaller point about what patient feedback there has been in relation to the pilot scheme in the south. Thank you.
Do you want to address, certainly point 1? I mean, I'm fully expecting that there has been conversation with patients and carers, etc. But
Yes, we have. We've been working with Health Watch through the pilot. So all the people who have been through the pilot have been discharged into the pilot beds, which number about 30 people now have agreed to participate. And there's feedback from their families as well, and it's been overwhelmingly positive. But we have had some really great feedback about the requirements for communication from the hospital. So, in other words, at the point of discharge, what type of communication is required and detail. Because sometimes when you're being discharged from hospital, it's in a big rush and things can be left out. So with the ICA, we're working with to develop a website for hospital discharge that people can access and also paper leaflets that can go with people and contact numbers so people can find out more. On the other point about the number of people who are coming out and the requirements for hospital discharge that changed during the pandemic, so that now there's a different criteria. It's called a criteria to reside in hospital. And that's changed dramatically at the point of the new guidance in 2020. So, for example, if people who were end of life in hospital would normally have stayed for, would have had a choice actually to stay there if they were in the last few days of life, last week of life. Well, now the criteria, or since the pandemic, were within hours of life. So that really hospitals count that. That's a national measure, how many people are counted in each trust as having a not criteria to reside. And so we've had to look at the type of people who are coming out of hospital who need support from a bedded facility. So, for example, they might not be able to call for help. They might have night needs that require support during, for a bed or to recuperate so they can actually go home. And there's been an NHS England toolkit that we used before we went into the pilot to account for those different types and criteria. So it's going to take a lot of work between ourselves and the acute trusts. And right now, we're going into winter. COVID is still an issue, both for staffing and for admissions to hospital. But there is a willingness, there are meetings that happen every week to try and resolve these very complex issues.
If I can come back on that, yes, we have teams that are embedded in the hospitals that work, and part of what they do is build relationships so that, we can get the appropriate care in place for people, because getting people in the right place is kind of a part of it. Is a conversation, isn't about a human thing. You will have an opinion on something, and, our teams work to try and make sure people are going in the right direction. But there is pressure in the system post-pandemic.
Thank you. Do we then have any further questions? Claire.
Thank you very much. Just a comment that I'm going to try and turn into a question, if I may. I've got a lot of experience over my whole life of working in the NHS. And my thought on reading this and hearing what's been said is very much about this is actually, you can put lots of processes in place, but ultimately it's about a culture change of moving to somewhere where patients are actively drawn or pulled out of hospital rather than waiting to be pushed. And it's addressing that culture change, really, that I think is likely to be key to making this work. And I just wondered if there was any thoughts on how we move forward with that culture change. And I absolutely understand that's not up to one part of the system, it's up to the whole system. But yeah, just some thoughts on that would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clara. I think you make a very good point, actually. It is important to do that. I am endlessly impressed with the enthusiasm of officers working in this area to try and do more for people and to talk about cultural shift, etc. You saw Mel's enthusiasm talking about the previous paper, and yes, I think we all can see the direction of travel that it ought to go in and are working towards that. But thank you, it's a good point.
I think It's culture change, yes, and the culture varies from hospital to hospital, from what I gather as well. So I think it's going to be a very nuanced and very different approach in the three acutes that we're dealing with. You hear horror stories of hospitals where it can take a day simply to get a prescription issued, and that's an extra day they've ended up having to stay in hospital because it's taken 8 hours for a prescription to turn up. There are elements of culture there that really do need to occur, in my view, if we are going to make this system work more seamlessly. But I still come back, the key thing for me is wherever possible, people should be at home, being supported in their own home, to be as independent as possible. If we do that, everything else gets significantly easier. Every person we can deliver that for takes strain off the rest of the system, which is, it's one of 2 or 3 key elements in terms of resolving the issues the NHS are facing at the moment. Simple, really, isn't it? Hey, yeah, okay. Any further questions? In which case, we've got the proposals. I'll second them. All in favour? Thank you. We then move on to Phil, Environmental Mitigation Framework.
There we go, we're back on again. Thanks. Okay, so as a local authority, we have a significant land holding. Some is made up of the agricultural estate and is leased and managed for agricultural production. However, what remains is very significant, is managed by us. Much of this is locked up in the operational estate, but some may have the capacity to address some of the objectives and strategic goals identified in the business plan. So these include the green and blue infrastructure, emerging local nature recovery strategy, the emerging local plan, climate strategy, the path to net zero. Now, in order to achieve this, the report presents the Environmental Mitigation Land Asset Management Framework. It's a bit of a mouthful. And this will provide a structure for assessing the land and developing initiatives to address these objectives through practical land-based means. Such schemes will include nutrient neutrality, biodiversity net gain, natural flood management, renewable energy, nature-based air quality improvements, carbon offsetting. The framework will ensure there is a consistent and robust approach across the estate, but also gives sufficient flexibility for responses that work with the conditions on the ground. It will also create a mechanism for site selection that is robust and ensures schemes are financially sound through development to implementation. The principle of stacking is also set out, whereby we will look to gain multiple stated benefits from schemes, as is the need to evaluate several competing schemes to look for the best outcomes. Furthermore, our intention is to look primarily at self-financing and low-risk schemes, but we're conscious of the potential for income generation and there's space for that to feed into decision-making. So the framework details the governance and financial approach in addition to engagement and communication with stakeholders. So essentially, we're going to be looking at our land and identifying anything which is currently not busy, carrying out operational activity, and we're going to look at how we can maximise its use for improving the environment and looking at those stated objectives that were within our business plan. So we've got a number of proposals there. Do you want them now, or shall I? Let's have a chat about it.
No, yeah, go on. We'll talk it through first.
Okay.
Comments from Cabinet on this? No, I mean, the Environment Act gives a lot of opportunity and creates some risk. We've highlighted some of this before with developer proposals for biodiversity net gain, with hedges surrounded by housing linked to nothing. It's really important that wherever possible, biodiversity net gain is properly embedded, is properly delivered in long-term sustainable ways. And that means landowners who are in it for the long run, town councils, Wiltshire Council, the large landowners in AONBs or in the national park. It's really important that we take this seriously. From what I'm hearing, the approach Wiltshire is taking is getting national recognition on this front. I think it's really important that we embed this. So yeah, I think it's a good scheme. There was an initial draft I can recall back when I held this brief a couple of years ago now, which was a little bit light touch. I think we've really got something now that is there that can deliver. If I then follow through on my list of people, Chris, I gather you're going to pretend to be Graham now.
I am. Thank you. Never spoken so much at Cabinet, I'll be quite honest. Yeah, this is, again, allow me to read a brief report from Councillor Graham Wright, who is chairman of the Climate Emergency Task Group, who unfortunately can't be with us this morning. The Environmental Mitigation Land Asset Management Framework was discussed with the Climate Emergency Task Group, who report into Environmental Select Committee on the 16th of September 22. The task group welcomes this development, particularly the creation of a framework to assess the options for using council land for often competing mitigation opportunities. This is an important agenda and where the task group believes the council can take a strong leadership role. The task group would again support and encourage the council to work with its tenant farmers to support environmental farming practices. Climate Emergency Task Group will continue to monitor progress with the implementation of this framework. Thank you.
Thank you. Ian?
Yes, thank you, Richard. Thank you for the report. It's a fascinating report, actually. A very good report. I've just got a couple of questions. One is as you say, it relates to the estate that isn't being used. So it doesn't include the county farms, for example, or indeed property that is land that's being used for other functions. So it's land that can be, in inverted commas, developed from a environmental mitigation point of view, I'm guessing.
Yeah, essentially. So we, obviously with county farms and the agricultural estate, we leave that to the leaseholders. Obviously with the operational estate, that has to go on and do its job. So yeah, we'll be looking at things like the highway land, patches of excess land within the HRA, and also other parts we own as well.
Yes, thank you for that. My second question, therefore, is what's the quantum? Do we have any sense of how, I know it's broken up into, therefore, from what you've said, very many parcels, but do we have any sense of what the quantum is? Because I'm just picking on the first item randomly, the nutrient neutrality addressed with very small parcels of land. I'm assuming that for that to work, it either requires partnership with neighbouring landowners or it requires land that we control to be fairly large. I mean, we're talking about quite a lot of water, or we're talking about the managed space that therefore creates some mitigation for non-nutrient neutral areas, I guess.
Sorry, non-nutrient neutral.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. It was it's almost
lost me there.
I have to say, it almost sounds like a council report, didn't it? The language I used there, but in terms
council
of
reports make sense.
I'm not sure I'd agree with you in every case, but nonetheless. So, in other words, areas that, of course, I seem to remember a long debate, or a reasonably long debate, a couple of years ago in terms of using SIL to provide funding to address issues where there are levels of nutrients that make house building impossible. So I'm just wondering, therefore my question is picking on the nutrient neutrality aspects, whether they're, in terms of the land we're talking about here, whether any of the land that's available is large enough to be of any use in relation to ensuring that we have some nutrient neutrality. I love alliteration, I'm sure you do too.
Yeah, it is a mouthful this morning. Yes, so some of our land is in fairly large quantities, other bits are quite small. So it's scattered out and there are a fair few parcels of it. So the framework sets out the sort of sifting process, really, how we're going to analyse what we've got and then match it against the various environmental needs. So there are a few schemes which have been identified in there which are sort of making progress in early stage, but it's very much about setting out an approach for assessing the land that we've got available and then matching it to the best environmental benefit.
Just adding to that, we've got we had a county farm, small dairy farm, where the tenant handed back in the tenancy. Small dairy is really hard to make viable at the moment. They, I gather, moved to, I think to a larger farm, I forget, somewhere in the southwest. Instead of trying to relet that, and that farm is just to the east of Salisbury because we've got the Avon nutrient neutrality issue there, that is now being developed primarily, not solely for nutrient neutrality, because you can get a lot more than one thing on land that you're using for it, particularly wetland, given the biodiversity that comes with it and the carbon capture. But that is now being used to provide nutrient neutrality offset and a nutrient sink. It's in the early stages, but that's one significant example. But as Phil says, it needs to be more widespread than that.
And it also, sorry, just to add to that as well, it also identifies the opportunity for stacking, which is where we don't obviously just focus on one benefit. We look at how we can stack several benefits, one upon the other, to obviously produce the most biodiverse and rich environments possible to achieve many of our goals in one.
Yeah, no, I noticed the stacking, and my final point would be, therefore, presumably at some point you'll come back to us or come back to your colleagues with a map or a plan that sets out the land holdings that you're referring to today and the mitigating activities that are taking place.
Yeah, so as they develop, as a result of the framework being put in, we can obviously go back and look at those, develop and review them.
But also, as we look at it as a council, it's not just our land. We're also engaging with town councils in particular. There's been a lot of work going on there. I'm sure Sarah Valdis would love to give an update to councillors at some point about it, because there really is some significant work being carried out and significant headway being made. So yeah, it's us working in partnership with others, as well as having a process for our own land. If this is going to succeed anywhere in the country, and if it is going to succeed, it will succeed in somewhere like Wiltshire with the breadth we've got. It's only going to do so by all of us, including people like Wiltshire Wildlife Trust, working together to deliver it. It's cumulative benefit that is really critical, not just the isolated areas. Thank you. Any further questions? Yes, Tony.
Thank you, Leader. Tony Jackson, Councillor for Warminster Broadway and a member of the Climate Change Task Group, at which I have mentioned a number of times the potential for hydroelectric. And in your sustainable energy paragraphs, you include solar, wind and battery storage, but don't include the potential of hydroelectric. So we live in a county which 200 years ago produced tons of wheat milled by mills on our rivers. And this energy, potential energy, remains today. And I wonder whether or not we could include potential hydroelectric in your renewable energy considerations. Thank you, Leader.
Yeah, it's not, sorry, I'll just come in there. It's not that we are, completely opposed to such schemes. I mean, obviously anything that comes forward would have to have a business plan behind it. But it's certainly something we'd happily look at and investigate.
And I would add, when a number of these schemes have been proposed previously, particularly in Salisbury. The viability has always been a tricky issue when you come with some of the hydroelectric schemes, some of the floating turbines. There's one example in the country, I think it's in Oxfordshire, where it might be Somerset, where they do have a scheme running that is generating energy, but it only functions financially with community volunteer support to keep it clear of the sort of detritus that clogs it up. So along with tidal, it's one of how to generate water power if you don't have big hills is one of those issues that I'm pretty sure technology is creeping towards solutions to, but the technology doesn't appear to quite be there yet to make it viable. As soon as it gets there, I think it's absolutely critical. Not the tidal stuff, we can't benefit from that, but the rivers, yeah, I think it's really important we do. Okay, if you now move the recommendations, please.
Thanks. Okay, so proposal is that members agree and adopt the Environmental Mitigation Land Asset Management Framework as included in Appendix 1. Authorise the Director for Assets and Commercial Development to determine the most appropriate use of assets when considered through the framework via the Asset Gateway and Capital Programme Board after consultation with the Cabinet Member for Housing, Strategic Assets and Asset Transfers, and to authorise the Director for Assets and Commercial Development to make any changes to the framework in circumstances where criteria for assessment, legislation or land ownership changes via the Asset Gateway and Capital Programme Board and the Cabinet Member for Housing, Strategic Assets and Asset Transfers.
Thank you. I will second that. All those in favour? Thank you very much. We come on to item 11, at which point I will hand over to Laura and send me a message when you're done.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just getting it up on the screen now for me. Okay, so disposal programme. Phil, I'll hand over to you to introduce.
Thanks, Laura. Okay, so this report notes the position in respect to capital receipts for the financial year to date and confirms the interest in 6 assets that are to be declared surplus and capable of review. The receipts target for the 2 financial years between 2021 and 23 is 7.814 million. The actual figure from last year and the forecast figure for the current one brings in 6.932 million. However, this is largely due to slippage and be reflected in next year's targets if it's not met between now and then for additional sales in the meantime. Okay, so the assets identified, in addition to that, the assets identified as surplus are listed in Appendix 2 and include sites in Melksham that have been released as a result of the opening of the campus, a bungalow in Calne, land at Morgan Rise Road belonging to the HRA, and land near the A345 north of the Countess roundabout. So this is the biannual report. It's a one that we get every time, but do you want me to go straight for the proposal on that?
Yeah, go straight to the proposal and then I'll open it up.
Okay. The proposal is that members note the position in respect of the completed and projected receipts for the financial year 22 to 23. The members confirm the freehold interest in the 6 assets can be sold to either generate capital receipts in support of the council's capital programme or reused to generate income or service delivery, community or strategic outcomes for the council. And then finally, where the decision is to dispose, authorise the Director for Assets and Commercial Development to dispose of the freehold interest in the assets, or in his absence, the Corporate Director for Resources.
Thank you, Phil. Any comments from Cabinet members? No? Okay. Ian, any comments or questions?
Thank you, Chair. No comments at all.
Have some excitement. Any further questions from members here? No? Okay, so Phil, you've moved the proposals.
I'm sorry, Chair, I put my hand up. I'm on Teams.
Gosh, John, that was like a voice from God. Hi, John, sorry, I've only just seen your hand. Apologies. Please fire away if you've got any questions.
How kind of you to finally recognise my proper role, Laura. I've just got 2 quick questions with regards to the items on Melksham, which we all knew were going to be coming up once the campus was completed. And it's just wanting to understand the wording with regards to the former library site and Lowbourne House, where it says car park included to consider options that retain car parking provision. I don't understand what that means. Does that mean that you've included Lowbourne car park but will be looking at alternatives to replace that parking? Or does it mean that you will be looking at whatever went into that site to retain some form of parking?
Phil, can you take that?
Yeah. Hi, John. So at the moment, the whole site, is being declared surplus, but the intention is to retain the parking. Does that help?
So the parking isn't actually surplus?
Not exactly. The parking isn't surplus, no, not at the moment. However, we would look to potentially incorporate that within anything that's developed on the site, if anything's developed on the site. We really don't know yet. It really comes down to exploring what comes forward.
Okay, so whatever goes into that site, you'll be looking to retain parking of some description?
Yeah, that's the intention.
Fine. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions, John?
No, that was my lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, if there are no other further questions or any virtual hands going up, then Bill, you've given the proposals. I'm happy to second. Cabinet happy to approve? Thank you. Okay, can someone let Richard back in the room? Thank you. Oh, I wish it was always that easy.
Great, thank you. I'm not sure that we can approve of John Hubbard's elevation to a status of deity. Paula had it running next door.
Outrageous.
I'm sorry, John. I don't think it's within the competence of this council to bestow that title upon you. I'm sorry. You're going to need to take it to a higher authority. Church of England. Right. So we then move on to item 12, allocation of land between general fund and housing reserve. Back to Phil.
Thank you. Okay, so this one is a technical exercise for the appropriations whereby assets are moved into the HRA from the general fund and from the general fund to the HRA. So it's very much a tidying up exercise. So you'll see in Appendix A and B the properties that we're looking to move. So there's 6 sites in Appendix A, and the intention is to move these into the HRA to allow for the provision of affordable housing, which of course is helps us meet our housing targets, or certainly move towards our supporting our council house build programme. And then in Appendix B, you'll see there's one property in Devizes which is currently used for adult social care provision. So this is to be moved over into the general fund, and that just regularises that arrangement, because obviously that's adult social care rather than affordable, the HRA. Okay, so so the proposal then, do you want that now, or do you want to?
Yeah, go for it. Go on. We don't need to read it in full. We can take it as read.
Okay, in that case, I'm happy to propose that.
Great, thank you. Any comments from Cabinet? As you say, this is really procedural. Ian?
Yes, thank you. I'm just waiting for somebody else's voice to come booming through now. It was a bit of a shocker, I thought, but there we go. Yes, thank you very much for the report. As you say, these are technical matters, but I do have a couple of questions. One is in relation to the property that's moving to the HRA, and in the final column of Appendix 1, we have an estimated market value, but I'm assuming there is no actual transfer of the fund. In other words, the HRA doesn't pay the general account or the general fund for the assets that it's receiving. It's a nil transaction, presumably. Is it?
There's
or not?
A debt transfer rather than capital receipt.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
It's a debt transfer rather than capital receipt.
It's a debt transfer. Okay, could you explain what that means, please?
I'm going to go over to Simon Hendy now and ask him to step in for me.
Yep, happy to step in. So in paragraph, I think is 26, so it's the impact on the council's capital financing requirements. So effectively, there's no cash transferring, but when I say the council's general fund capital financing requirement goes down, and the HRA's capital financing requirement goes up. Therefore, the amount that the HRA pays on that debt has to go up, and the amount that we pay on that debt, in theory, goes down as well. So the calculation and the appropriations are done through that method rather than any physical cash transferring between the two accounts.
That's helpful, thank you. My second question is the reference to the Secretary of State in terms of assets that move from the HRA to the general fund, which I think is one property, if I've read the report correctly. If that is right, that's correct? It's just one property that's moving.
It's land rather than a building.
Oh, sorry, I thought it was a building. That's my.
Oh, sorry, no, it's a building. Hang on, let me just go back to it.
I thought it was a sort of house that's being transferred across. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, Simon, did you want to come in on that one?
It's a bungalow.
Richard, I do read the reports, you see, so.
Good to see someone being ready.
Sorry, it's a bungalow that will be transferring. It's occupied by somebody that has a social care need at the moment.
Absolutely.
So that's why it's transferring.
And I have no problem with that whatsoever. So my question is, and it's more a kind of academic question, does that really go before the Secretary of State? Surely to goodness, he or she's got something better to do, surely, than to sit there approving a bungalow moving from an HRA to a general fund? Question mark.
I doubt they've got anything better to do than think about what's going on in Wiltshire.
I really wouldn't want to comment on the competencies or otherwise of the system in Westminster, no. I believe legally there is a requirement for it to be approved. I suspect it's a relatively simple process in this regard. Any other questions? No? Happy, in which case we've moved the recommendations. I'll second them. All in favour? Thank you. We're coming on to the last item. Before I do...
It's not the last item.
It's not? Second to last item. It's penultimate item, I apologise. Before I do, John, I just think just from a safeguarding perspective, I just want to check something here. You've not changed your name to Caligula. You're not proposing making your horse a councillor or senator. You haven't got a pet called Incitatus.
Behave, Richard.
No, good. I thought we should just take safeguarding very seriously.
I could have great fun by calling out things at any point now, couldn't I?
Okay. If we then move on to Nick and update on the local development scheme. Nick.
Thanks, Richard. Well, this, as the report says, the LDS is a statutory document which was last updated over a year ago. And of course, since then, we've had, I think, at least 3 mooted changes to central government's planning numbers for new homes. The latest, of course, being announced with some fanfare quite recently. And speaking personally, I await that the detail behind that with some trepidation. Let's just see what comes out of it. The local plan process, of course, as we said several times this morning, is evidence-led, and as circumstances change, so can some of the evidence, and hence the time required to process that evidence. I don't think it's not been a very well-kept secret that this process was subject to some delays, and certainly, personally, I've said since early summer that we're probably not going to make the deadline, the previous deadline of the end of the year to produce a draft plan. I say this with a heavy heart. No one, including me, absolutely no one wants to see any delays to this process. If they can be avoided, that's got to be the way that we do it. However, we are in a situation where we can't avoid some of these consequences. So just looking at the past and hindsight being that amazing thing, and trying to give some sort of value judgment, were we guilty of a bit of over-ambition in our timetable planning? Yes, I think that would be a fair assessment. I would, though, say, it's better to be over-ambitious than to be under-ambitious. And I remain a generally over-ambitious person. Have there been changes beyond our control? Well, very much that has been the case, as referred to the various seeming policies that are being pursued at government level. Are the changes that have been brought about by things that have happened here? Yes, to an extent. The decision to model for the lower end, which was generally well received, the lower end of the housing numbers, certainly has required some new evidence gathering, and there have been other processes that have also required much greater collection of evidence. So we don't, I didn't start out by wanting to delay this process, but this is the realistic timetable and the consequence of all the situations that I've explained. Very much, and of course next year we're looking at, we don't want to start putting a draft plan out in the middle of the school holidays. So there are reasons why it's a little bit longer than even perhaps the processors would require. So that's where we are. Enjoy it, read it. I'm sure you'll find it absolutely thrilling. Happy for questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions, comments from Cabinet first? I mean, I think I would add that if we had a local plan out with an inspector at the moment and suddenly seeing government's potential changes to housing targets, I'd be feeling a little bit frustrated, if I was honest.
We'd be up that creek without
Yeah.
that proverbial paddle, wouldn't we?
Quite what the changes that government are likely to put in effect come April will mean, and mean potentially then for the local plan is a totally different different matter, but one that we will find in due course. Okay. Aside from that, the position is the position that we're in. We've now had a number of questions put forward again on this topic, so I'll come to those. If I start with Anne Henshaw. Anne, do you have a supplementary?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I do. On the response that I received from my question, the statement, there will be no public consultation undertaken ahead of the full public consultation that will be undertaken on the draft plan next year, which will clarify the options that are being considered in identifying site allocation proposals. Now, my question is, does that mean that is the Regulation 19 stage of the consultation? Is that what that's referring to? Because if it is, strictly speaking, in my understanding, Regulation 19 stage is only really examining the soundness of the plan, not intricate and multiple differences that may have been introduced into it since the previous round of consultations, which are consultation 18 stage, where the questions are much more widely based, broader based, and have a much wider engagement with the public. So can I have clarification that despite all the very fundamental evidence bases that have changed since January 2021, when the public were fully consulted under Regulation 18, we're now waiting until, according to your chart, the third quarter of 2023, when we will go directly to Regulation 19, which will not be at all the same kind of consultation with the public, as I understand it, as would have been with a fairly fundamental change in the plan. I just draw your attention to the fact that Swindon Borough Council have decided to, despite having done Regulation 18 once, scrap it and now start again and do a new Regulation 18 consultation, which is going to be next year, followed by Regulation 19 following it, which is the proper procedure. So I'm a slightly, I'd like to know, have an answer perhaps from the officer present, exactly how you're going to manage these two completely different processes, given that you'll be producing a very, very different plan. Thank you.
Nick.
Well, I would challenge the very different plan comment. My understanding, and we'll get the officer to comment as well, is that we will be producing a draft plan. So that will be the plan in its form, but draft form. And that consultation, people can respond to whatever aspect of that that they choose. It won't include options, because those options are the ones that are being consulted on before, but it will be up for consultation. So people can make whatever points they want. That's my understanding, but let's hear from the head of spatial planning.
Nick, you're joining us online, or?
Since the head of spatial planning was here, I thought we would go to her. But if the chief planning officer wants to respond as well, I'm very happy.
Whoever, please.
We'll let Georgina speak first, if that's okay, Leader.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. I think there is a difference, but only possibly slightly. Regulation 18 is what I think we know as front-loading consultation. So there is a discretion for the authority in terms of what they choose to consult on. And the consultation that we did back in 2021 was designed to help us understand about scales of growth, as Councillor Bottrell have said, is what the options are at particular places in terms of growth. And that's given us a very good basis on which we are able now to move forward and develop and shape the draft plan. At the Regulation 19 stage, which is what we're heading towards now, we are looking to obviously have that complete plan, which we can then share. It will have the evidence underpinning it. It will illustrate and show the options that have been looked at in terms of identifying where allocations will go at places. So from my perspective, and I'm sure Nick will come on as Chief Planning Officer shortly, we are in a very good position to move forward. And I guess at some point you need to present the full plan with the evidence in place in order to allow people to see that in its totality. And they will be able to, through the Regulation 19 stage, comment on the soundness of that plan, whether it's justified and whether it meets all the legal tests. So it's a very comprehensive stage in the process.
Thank you. If I may just add, if that's okay.
Please, Nick. Yeah.
Yeah, just very briefly. Obviously, the statutory requirement is to carry out the initial Regulation 18 consultation, and the issues that came out of that process was such that's given us the confidence that we can now move on to Regulation 19 stage. We don't believe that the changes will be that fundamental to justify a further round of reconsultation. Clearly, we take into account those comments that were made as part of that earlier stage. So yes, the intention is that we'll go out to full public consultation at Regulation 19 stage in later on obviously next year, and that will give the community the opportunity to make any comments they wish.
And Nick, if I can just follow up and ask, at the risk of playing devil's advocate, were the government changes to housing to result in, for example, housing authorities that have over-delivered being able to reduce their housing targets by a similar amount to the amount they've over-delivered? Do we have an understanding yet what the implications of that would be, or do we need to see what the legislation says to understand?
Yes, I mean, the devil clearly will be in the detail when we get that from government. But what we want to make sure is that the homes that we're providing for are sufficient to meet the needs of our local communities. And if we need to adjust the figures as we progress through the remaining months of preparing the draft plan, then clearly we'll need to do that. My feeling is that the numbers won't change substantially, but as I say, until we actually see the detail from government, it's very difficult to say.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Henshaw, did you want to come back in?
Yes, please. Yes. Well, that's interesting. I'm just wondering how the team, the spatial planning team, are going to cope with what are clearly quite fundamental differences in the public opinion about where allocations should be. And particularly, I'm thinking about the major market towns, and many of them running up and down the A350, where we've been through many debates and many issues and conversations on that. And that will, of course, as you just said, depend on what the targets or possible targets are going to be. But the magic words which have come in now, and I just wonder how much Wiltshire is going to make it clear to the public what it means, is the word constraints, because you are only going to be building within the constraints of your boundaries. That is a very new concept, which was not there before. We used to talk about environmental constraint. This is a much wider approach. And that's my question as to how the public are going to be engaged again on the wider issues. It seems to me that you're going to keep it quite small, and they're saying that there isn't actually going to be any fundamental change and that all our allocations are going to stay as they are. I find that a rather strange approach, given the fairly basic social, environmental and employment economic issues that have taken place since the last consultation. That's more of a comment. Shall I move on to not save to save time with my second question, or would the officer like to return?
Was there a response anyone wanted to give there? I mean, unless I'm missing something, my understanding would be the evidence that came through from that consultation will shape what now comes out, because it needs to be based very much on the evidence that has come forward, whether it be evidence from the public or evidence from highway surveys or evidence from anything else that has come out in that process.
Certainly, Chairman, but of course, with every set of objections or controversy, when we get to Regulation 19 stage, that will lead to delays, big delays, and that will delay your plan getting in front of an inspector. Whereas if you went through a screening process, which would be a semi-repeat of Regulation 18 first, you'd have actually by then passed through a certain period, and you get to what the true period of Regulation 19 is, which is to discuss the soundness of the plan, not the intricate detail. Some of that will go in front of an inspector. So there is a very good reason for these two processes and why they follow on after each other. You are showing a big gap. Much time, much change has taken place since Regulation 18 last year. And now we're talking about nearly 2 years later, a process which is not exactly the same process at all. And I'm just flagging it up that I'm not quite sure how the public will take that.
Okay, all I can do is refer to officers' advice there as to how we need to proceed with the circumstances we're in.
Right. My second question is to do with LTP4, your local transport plan. I received a note from Parvis Kansari a couple of months ago saying that LTP4 was going out for public consultation September to December 2023. Looking at your most recent projection for the local plan, you're going to be doing that consultation at the end of 2023. So my question is, will the LTP4 consultation responses be properly fed into the process of the local plan consultation so that the two are properly integral and should run as any transport plan and local plan should, absolutely intimately intertwined?
Thank you. Again, I think we're going to need to look to officers for the detailed response there. Parvis?
Thank you. I think it's a simple yes to that.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. We then come to Ernie, who isn't here. Claire?
Thank you very much. So I do have some additional questions to the ones that I put in. I asked the supplementary on question 1 previously, so I'm coming to, there was nothing on question 2. So on question 3, which was about the current site allocations, my question there was what will Wiltshire Council do to proactively ensure that brownfield is used first and at sufficient density to make a very significant reduction in the planned urban sprawl that giving priority to greenfield development inevitably leads to? Shall I go on to question 4? Or do you want to
come on that?
Go for it, please.
I think there's sort of a bit of a the feeling here is wrong. You know, the idea that somehow brownfield sites are not exploited enough, and that somehow we willy-nilly go for greenfield sites over brownfields is I think wrong. Brownfield sites are at the heart already of what we are doing, but we have to understand, and you know, I've only been a property developer at the rubbishy tiny end, but there are lots and lots of problems often with redeveloping brownfield sites, which make them more time consuming and more expensive to develop. And that is why they don't come forward, I suspect, at the rate which we would like them to. But the idea that we somehow don't prioritize them or don't think it's important to do brownfield first, I totally dispute that, I'm afraid. So, yeah, I'll be interested to know what additional things government says one can do. But you know, it's not that we're sitting on our hands on this one.
Well,
Yeah, I mean, I've heard what you said, and I do take that on board. My question was, what can we proactively do further to make more brownfield sites come forward? I accept you're not sitting on your hands. However, there are opportunities that are not being taken that allow us, that allow developers to land on the greenfield sites and concrete out and out from our town centres, which is kind of the wrong way round. And I'd just like some reassurance that Wiltshire Council, Cabinet, the local plan, whichever way you want to frame it, will start to take even more seriously the need to reuse existing land, however difficult that is, instead of continuing to cover our countryside, our valuable farms and wildlife and forest areas and everything else that we've all talked about a lot, so that that really can happen. I appreciate it's difficult. I get that there is some dependence on the government, but I would just like to see us really be
You're not going to like
majoring on it. Thank you.
You're not going to like my answer, because my answer is, well, change the taxation situation, but that's not something that obviously we can do, or change the environmental considerations, which again, of course, is not something we do. I mean, it is perverse, is it not, that, you know, as a result of we talked about nutrient offsetting and things earlier on, but for a developer wanting to develop, buying a farm and stopping farming probably would contribute half the nitrate quota that it would need. So actually, there's a perverse incentive to build on green fields in that sense. And that is, you know, well-meaning legislation in the Environment Act 2021, etc. But that is the situation. And, you know, it is, you have to look at all these things, and there are lots of unintended consequences. So that's not really to answer your question, what more can we do? You know, we can do what we can do, and I will ensure that we will do everything we possibly can. But, you know, a lot of these levers are not ones within our control.
And just to add, I'll try and specifically answer. We've already done a huge amount in terms of lobbying. The only body that will change this is central government. As long as 5-year land supply sits there in the way it does, and developers say brownfield's not viable, it's not going to be developed, and there will be an ability to develop elsewhere. Brownfield development is more expensive. The only way it will happen is if government does something to either enable more brownfield development through funding, which they are looking at doing. That primarily applies to large cities, or through restricting the ability to build on greenfields and therefore making brownfield sites the option that people have got to look at. We have been lobbying extremely hard there. I have had inordinate meetings with both our MPs in Wiltshire and other MPs across the country. I can't say going to party conference is my favourite thing, but when I'm there, I bend the ear of every MP who I can sit down for a cup of coffee with, and I'm getting to know a number of them. And you can see the impact of the lobbying that has been achieved both by us, by other councils, in some of the changes coming through right now with the planning bill. I am back to the point, the devil is in the detail. So we need to see clarity on that. There are some elements of it, particularly around 5-year land supply, that are very welcome and I think would have an impact on brownfield allocations, providing, and we're back to where we started, the local plan has the evidence to assign them under whatever process of sifting the local plan prioritises such brownfield sites, which is not within our control. that's within their control of that evidence-based process. I'm fed up with saying that today, sorry, but
Thank you. We'll trust you to keep on with the lobbying because in opposition, we don't have that same influence, unfortunately. So the next one I had was in regard to my question number 4, which was about the policies and plans which go into the local plan. So my supplementary there was, can we expect to see the policies in the local plan? I guess, hopefully, yes, but I'd like to hear that. And what action is Wiltshire Council taking to ensure the widest possible involvement in developing these policies? And that touches a little bit on what I said earlier on, reflecting on what Anne Henshaw just said about Section 18 consultation, and hearing that that's not going to be repeated to reflect potential changes in numbers and the evidence that yourself, Richard, referred to earlier. But surely drawing in experts, thought leaders and local people to contribute to all of that, particularly in relation to the climate and ecological emergency, is kind of what we need to be doing. And will the level of affordable homes required for all the developments be consistently delivered? That's mentioned, but we need to see it delivered, not just put in the plans. And Richard, you also mentioned that earlier on that local facilities can come with development. So we want to see the investment in the local social infrastructure from the housing developments at Birds Marsh, at Hunter's Moon, and we need to hear assurance that similar facilities will be delivered in Chippenham at Chowell Farm and Rawling Green developments, because it just doesn't seem to go right the way through the process. It would speak about it, and then when it comes to it, there's a battle to actually deliver what's needed. And I wondered if you've got any thoughts on that. Do you want to take that one, or shall I finish off at?
Go on,
Well, I just really, you can only comment on a point like that. I think consultation is clearly at the heart of it. And again, I think there's this sort of feeling that, oh, well, we only consult in a half-hearted way and we don't really take on board what people say. Well, we spend a lot of time consulting and we spend a lot of time analysing those results. What, of course, consultation isn't, is it's not an opinion poll or it's not a beauty contest. Or a referendum. It is what, it is to see what people consider to be the main issues and to look at those issues and see how they relate to what's being proposed. So, of course, lots of people will take away from it, oh, well, they didn't take any notice of what I said because, they're still going ahead. That, of course, is not the point. So I can only assure you that everything is done that is realistically possible to make those exercises as genuine, as they can be. And, the Reg 19 that we will engage in will be a genuine consultation. And, it is quite difficult, though, to get people to, I seem to remember at Reg 18, a quarter of the responses came from 2 divisions in Bradford upon Avon, and yet it covered the whole of the area, the council area. So we've really got to look at how do we get people to engage in the process, and as councillors, we all bear some responsibility for that. We've got to get our neighbours and all the parish councils and the groups and things to really get stuck in. To this, and to actually make sure that everybody is aware of what's going on. A number of times, I get written to quite a lot about various developments, and these are developments that were part of the, planned for in the core strategy, and yet they've come completely out of the blue because people haven't actually managed to be, for one reason or another, not probably their own fault, engaged in the process. And we have got to always do better. I agree with you.
I would just add on infrastructure, again, perhaps you might want to have a chat with your leader who seems to be against infrastructure-led development. It comes with problems, as we've seen. Infrastructure from cookie-cutter developments, we know it doesn't come in the way we want. That's why that master planning approach is, from everything we can see, the only way that you're going to deliver infrastructure-led development. But it's hard to do. You have one more question.
Yes, thank you for that. Just reflecting on what I've heard, and I do understand that there's a difference between the sort of consultation type questionnaires where questions are limited and people don't have the opportunity to put forward ideas, and something that's much more of an engagement, get people in the room, come up with some innovation, and really express ideas that I think a lot of people would be more tempted to get engaged with. And, you know, I think back to the consultation on the HIF, where the questions didn't even include the no road option, and people had to write that in a comment. You know, they were offered 3 choices, none of which they wanted. In fact, none of those were the result of the survey at all. It became a hybrid of them all. So no wonder people start to feel a bit disengaged, because they just don't feel that they've been heard. I absolutely get the difficulty, but I think, as you said, we could do a bit better. So my last question, you'd be glad to know, was about the affordable and sustainable homes for Wiltshire. And I'm afraid it does go back a little bit to the brownfield site that's referred to in the response. And the result of that was the fact that we don't build out and develop our brownfield sites quite as much as we absolutely could. And back to the HIF Road, which was misleadingly portrayed by the project and by Wiltshire Council as a bypass that would solve traffic problems, rather than being the low-speed distributor road, which is what it was going to be, and serving that huge development, and therefore adding traffic to Chippenham. So really what I want to hear is whether going forwards, reflecting on that, communication related to future plans, whether that be the local plan or any other plans for the Chippenham area, are absolutely scrupulously accurate, and any misinterpretations are corrected, because I do think that's where we, ran into some difficulties here. And just going forward, we've heard about the need for Ross, Councillor Henning, spoke about the need for solving the traffic issues in the centre of Chippenham. So, how can we involve the local community in meaningfully I'll just say meaningfully researching the traffic flows so that options can be potentially co-designed without relying on large developments to enable them. So I'm thinking about the context that any solutions that come up need to be fit for the 21st century, with much, much less reliance on cars and much more on active travel and reliable public transport, which goes back to the comment that we had about the local plan. And you'll be very glad to know that's the end of my questions and hopefully the end of my comments. Thank you very much.
I think I would challenge, and I'm all for consultation and making consultation meaningful, but you have a problem when you try and design something through that sort of multifarious process, because you are trying to you'll have competing interests from people who at one stage are just merely sort of road users, to others who live right next door to the road, to others who will be affected or have views or whatever. And so it's a classic case of competing interests. That's planning is, is often the case with planning related matters. And that's where a statutory body like the council has to try and resolve those and work out what is, because everybody can't be a winner. That's fundamentally, at the end of this day, you can't build a society on everybody getting their way. There has to be some concessions, some, give and take, and those interests have to be balanced and weighed up. And that's what the council can do. I'm not saying that that doesn't make the people who don't agree with the council's conclusions, that will not make them happier. But the process has been undergone, the process has been carried out thoroughly, diligently, and as effectively as it possibly can. And, that I go back to my previous answer, that's what we will try and do. We can't make everybody happy, but we can try and get to the best overall solution for things. And, if we failed in the past, well, we agree we need to be better.
I'm going to make a couple of comments as well. I must admit, I'm a bit confused about the policy coming out from the Liberal Democrats here. Ian doesn't want HIF at all. You'd like the road, but no housing, thank you. Well, how do you get housing without a road? You need to get funding from DFT for a bypass, but Melksham bypass you don't seem to want. You've got to be real about this. Ross, you're absolutely right. If you want to see the infrastructure, you're going to have to take some housing to go with it. It's the only way that you will access the funding. So if that's what you want, that's the price you have to pay. On a question on affordable housing, sorry, I didn't respond on previously. I would love to see in the local plan, and again, it has to be evidence driven, but I would love to see affordable targets of 40% and delivered everywhere. I suspect that's probably not quite realistic because you've got the viability issues and arguments that come in. Government is moving to make it to be much more assertive in pushing for affordable housing targets and for them to be met. But the reality, I suspect, is that it will be less than perfect, but better than it was. At the moment, we have targets theoretically at 40%. That's 30% in many areas. But actually, the reality is when you take into account sites under 10 houses in rural areas that have no affordable requirement, the average is below that. We need to do what we can in this local plan, providing the evidence stacks up, and back to that evidence, to try and push that number up. But it goes in competition with all the other requirements we have for example, infrastructure. If you want infrastructure, it will take funding away from affordable housing. There's an issue about what the priorities are.
If it's okay, may I just come
Yeah.
back? Just to clarify that I did not say that I wanted a road with no houses. Absolutely, I did not say.
You asked us how we could have a road without housing.
No, I didn't.
Well, I'll listen back. If I got that wrong, I apologize, but I'm pretty sure that's what I heard.
I said solutions to the traffic problems in the centre of Chippenham. I didn't say build a road round the edge to do that. Right. I said let's look creatively at how those problems can be solved. I didn't say build a road round the edge. I'm absolutely clear about that.
All right.
Absolutely clear about that.
We can listen back and check it. If I got it wrong, I apologize. I'm pretty sure that's what I thought you said.
I mean, if I misspoke or if there's any misinterpretation, I'm being absolutely clear now. That is not what I said or meant. Thank you.
Fine, thanks. Right, that comes to the end of questions. Chris, you're pretending to be Jerry.
Thank you. Yes, a brief statement from Councillor Derek Clunkler, Chairman of the Environment Select Committee. The Environment Select Committee received a presentation on progress with the Wiltshire Local Plan Review and the Gypsy Traveller Plan on the 20th of September. The Select Committee sought details on the timelines and the consultation process and being consistent with national framework policies. Comments were made on alignment with the Council's climate strategy and the local transport plan. The Select Committee will continue to monitor the development of the Gypsy and Traveller Plan and the Wiltshire Local Plan. That's it.
Thank you. Ian.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Can I just congratulate Chris on all of his efforts today? Oh, my Lord. And if anybody deserved an extra SRA, it will be Chris for covering off all those others. But obviously, the others would lose a bit of theirs so that we balance the whole thing up looking Andy at this point. And can I also congratulate Nick Thomas on having, yet again, another wonderful Khan image behind him. I congratulate everybody.
Can we just crack on with questions?
On all the
please,
images.
Ian? It's been a long
It would just
day.
be great to have a
let's get to the
Khan
point.
image behind somebody, but it is a lovely photograph, Nick. Yes, 2 or 3 points, as Richard will be delighted to hear. and it may all be in the papers, so Richard can complain that I haven't read the papers fully. The extension from 2036 to 2038, if somebody could just remind me in a moment why we've extended. I assume that's because the timescales have spread, or perhaps more evidence is required. But if somebody can just confirm that, that would be very helpful. My second point is, I take Nick's frustration about the timescale, but I have to say my view is I'd rather we take longer to get it right, so that we get to an examination and we're secure. I'm sure we will be, but nonetheless, we are very, very secure in our presentation at the examination. And just two other quick points. One is I seem to remember some time ago, we're probably talking 2+ years ago, that in terms of the market towns, there was a kind of hierarchy based on a number of factors. There were 4. I can only remember 3 offhand, so I apologise. One was about employment. The second was about, I think, biodiversity, and the third was about landscape. And I just wanted to understand if that was still the case as we move forward. And then let me finish by making a small contribution to the debate about consultation. I think there's an inherent problem with consultation around the planning process, and that is the conflict that occurs in terms of policy, legislation, and people's aspirations. I mean, I agree that it's not an opinion poll or a referendum, but I think it would be nice occasionally if views were more actively taken on board. And so it slightly takes us back to a conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago about consultation, one in terms of how we set the parameters in terms of what's up for discussion and debate, and 1 and 2, how we reflect in our documentation what we have changed based on the consultation, because I think it does lend credibility and robustness to the process when people can see why their views have been rejected, but equally why they have been adopted, endorsed, and the context for it. So, but just 1 or 2 questions in relation to the additional 2 years, I think, and the point about the hierarchy and the criteria for the hierarchy. Thank you, Richard.
Yes, I think was the answer I had to the first question about the timescale. I think the rest were all sort of rather comments, weren't they? Really?
Sorry, you need to use your mic, otherwise people online can't hear you.
I beg your
actually
pardon.
the answer was paragraph 8, page 128, to your first question, but go on.
Thank you, Richard. So my second point is in relation to the hierarchy that was set out some time ago, and it's just a confirmation that's still broadly the policy that we're adopting. Thank you.
I think you're referring to spatial strategy and the fact we've got the 3 principal settlements, Chippenham, Salisbury, Trowbridge, and then the market towns, and then we go down to the rural settlements. As I think we've spoken previously, it's the plan review, and we're not proposing to change that hierarchy, and growth will obviously be attributed according to relative constraints or the need to grow particular settlements. So that has been taken into account, but I can have a separate conversation if that would be helpful about some of the detail behind that.
A separate conversation would be very helpful, but that was a very helpful response. Thank you very much. Thank you, Richard.
Marvellous. Thank you. Do we have any further comments from members on this item? No, I will strike while I can then and ask that we move the recommendations. Again, no need to read.
Could I ask the recommendations that are on?
You need to be mic on, sorry.
As for the recommendations which are on page 125, approves the revised LDS and brought into effect through publication, and authorise the Chief Planning Officer in consultation with the Cabinet member to make minor amendments to the local development scheme where necessary.
I'll second. All those in favour? Thank you. We do now move on to the last item on the agenda, which is children's home care. Laura.
I know this is what you've all been waiting for. So this is very simple, and it sort of echoes Jane's earlier paper about the need for some more flexibility in the way we commission domiciliary care for our children aged up to 25. This is care that's in their home or at a CQC registered home. And this is where we give children help with personal care and support to enable them to increase their confidence and independence. Children's home care services have been purchased through Help to Live at Home framework, but there's now a need to re-engage with the provider market to deliver a new flexible framework for children's home care. The overall aim is to increase the capacity by opening up the market so we can find more providers to meet our needs. I think if you see figure 1 on page 160, it really demonstrates the level of increase of need. And what's really worrying me is there are currently 25 active children's packages of care, with a further 17 we're unable to find support for through our current contract. And we've got 3 that have been open for over a year. And the care packages prevent children, good care packages prevent children from coming into residential care. So it's really vital that we get this right. So in summary, the new model will offer the flexibility for providers to charge different rates depending on location and unsociable hours. And you can see in the report there are various levels of support that families need. So we want to separate the children's home care services from adults. This is a material change from the proposals made in the Cabinet paper in April 22. We propose a 2-year flexible framework arrangement with an option to extend by 2 years. And I'm asking the Cabinet to agree to the proposals on page 158 of the Cabinet report.
Thank you, Laura. There is a part 2 to this item, which covers some of it's got some financial information in that we'll come to in due course. But before we do that, if we just work through the public section, Cabinet, are there any comments? No. My only view, one would be that again, I think this is sensible. I think proceeding with it is great. Technically, my notes tell me that John might want to talk, though I don't know. John is on the call. He may want to come in, or do you want to pretend to be John first? John wants to talk himself.
I've just got the message from John to say that he would like to comment on this, please. So I'll leave it to John, the expert.
John.
I think experts pushing it a little bit. I prefer being God. But anyway, thank you, Richard. I just wanted to say that Jackie and I did receive a briefing on this. And as Laura just said, this is a change in moving it away from adults. But we are more than satisfied that this is absolutely the best way to be going. And from the briefing that we received, which we're very grateful for, we think this is a very good step forward.
Great, thank you. Ian.
Thanks, Chair. Nothing to add, but to wish everybody a very Merry Christmas.
Right, okay. Do we have any further questions from members? In which case, if we move on to excluding the press and public.
Wait a minute, do we need to approve
No,
that?
we need to approve it in part 2.
Okay, thank you.
So if I move the following resolution to agree that in accordance with section 100A brackets 4 of the Local Government Act 1972, to exclude the public from the meeting for the business specified in item number 17, because it's likely that if members of the public were present, there would be a disclosure to them of exempt information as defined in paragraph 3 of part 1 of schedule 12A to the Act, and the public interest in withholding the information outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information to the public. Do I have a seconder? All those in favour? Thank you. So before we go to part 2, again, for anyone listening online, we are definitely now close enough to say Happy Christmas. I agree. So if we now close the meeting, please, to the public, and we will then deal with part 2.
So
We're not there yet.
oh.